An alarm went off, and the barriers of over 50 extractors activated at once. They all looked at their barriers to see what was up. Then they all sighed in annoyance. They had to work. They hated work. Still, they knew this was necessary. If they didn't do it now, there would be even more work waiting for them later. As long as they got this out of the way quickly, they could get back to chilling. They saw that a dense mass of Specter Zephyx had just passed through the magnetic field around the city. The walls weren't walls at all but huge machines, generating magnetic fields that reacted to Zephyx from any Specter. The entire city was surrounded by this machine. It had been a great investment, since they could now just stay in the city and wait for Specters to come to them. They didn't need to run around outside anymore. They also didn't need to investigate every nook and cranny of the city. No Specter could get into the city without going through the magnetic field or destroying part of the machine. Like this, the Extractors could chill all day, except for the times they had to work with Specters. The researchers who invented this technology were rewarded with a great salary for the rest of their lives, without needing to work another day. A couple months of hard work would pay off with less work in the future, which was how the engineers had brought themselves to invest so much effort into it. Depending on the density of the Specter's Zephyx, only fitting Extractors were alerted. The machine said the Specter was a fanatic at least. Because of that, every specialist and hero received the alert. While the Extractors lamented having to move their asses, they still reacted quickly. The quicker they finished, the quicker they could get back to chilling. Within an instant, several Extractors found the Specter. It was a tall man with black hair. He looked like an athletic human, but he clearly emanated Specter Zephyx. This was undoubtedly a Specter. The Specter looked up at the first person to appear. It was an early specialist who had already been pretty close. Then the Specter narrowed its eyes. Whoom! An explosion of light blinded the specialist. When his eyesight recovered, he already saw tens of Extractors rushing past him. The Specter moved with extreme speed that shocked the specialist. The Specter was insanely fast. It had to be a peak fanatic at least. Seeing that, most of the specialists smiled in relief. That meant they were too weak to be of help. Nice. That was enough excitement for today. Time to relax. Almost all the specialists turned around and went back into the city, while the peak specialists and heroes continued charging forward. The Specter noticed 12 heroes charging after it with weapons drawn. 12 heroes chasing it was already crazy, but at least 4 of them were mid-heroes. The heroes were faster than the Specter and gained ground rapidly. Whoom! The Specter was forced to unleash another burst of blinding light and punch the ground to dig into the wasteland. However, the light only worked on 8 of them. The other 4 had changed their barrier setting to defend against blinding light. Defending against a big arc of light consumed a large amount of Zephyx, but it was worth it to keep the target in sight. Bang! One of the heroes fired, and the ground beneath the Specter exploded. The Specter's attack hit nothing but air. A moment later, the other hero's eyesight recovered, and they changed their barrier settings in an instant. The teamwork of these heroes was impressive. Although how could it not be? None of them wanted to work or put in effort. Conflict was effort. What was the point of trying to one-up each other? Everyone got the same amount of work, and everyone worked together to keep the status quo with as little effort as possible. All of them were experienced, and all of them genuinely worked toward the same goal. The Specter tried to escape into the ground again. Bang, bang, bang. More heroes drew their weapons and attacked the ground beneath the Specter. It didn't manage to escape, since the ground kept moving away from it. Bang! The first hero reached the Specter and slammed his huge shield into it. The Specter tried to block, but the hero's power was immense, and it was thrown back. Bang, bang! The other heroes unleashed a couple of weaker attacks. The Specter's legs and arms broke open, revealing bony, bloody insides. Seeing that the Specter core wasn't in the extremities, the heroes used stronger attacks. Boom! All the extremities were destroyed, leaving behind a torso and head. The Specter couldn't move anymore, and the heroes rapidly surrounded it. They lowered its Zephyx storage with controlled attacks and put Zephyx suppressors around its body. It was suppressed. The Specter had seemed quite experienced at running, and its light ability had been useful for it. However, a single peak fanatic couldn't escape 12 heroes. Not sure if I should feel sorry for you or envy you, one of the heroes said, looking at another. The other frowned. I don't know either. It seems easy to manage, a third said. Security won't be an issue. I think that means you're lucky. That's not the point, a fourth said. Sure, it seems easy to manage, but it's a peak fanatic or initial demon. If it's a demon, one of them might have to work even more now. I think they have bad luck. The second one sighed. I hope it's a peak fanatic. It's your turn, the first said. I know, the second said. The other heroes slowly flew back to the city, leaving two behind. These two wore the same uniform, showing they belonged to the same manufacturer. The one who hadn't spoken yet looked at the other neutrally. You're still an initial hero. Yes, yes, I know, the other answered, then sighed again. Yes, I'll deal with it. The first showed a small smile and wordlessly flew back to the city. In this city, manufacturers didn't fight over Specters. More Specters meant more work. Since nobody wanted to deal with the Specters, everyone agreed to take turns accepting new ones. This time, it was this manufacturer's turn. If they were lucky, they'd get a hatchling possession Specter, impossible to work with, which they could throw into the back of a warehouse for eternity. If they had bad luck, they'd get a force Specter that produced a ridiculous amount of Zephyx but required a lot of hours to extract it. This one wasn't a force Specter, but it was pretty strong. The Extractor sighed again, grabbed the Specter and flew back into the city. The hero walked into a big congregation of cube buildings and entered. Inside, the buildings were dirty and poorly kept. The doors looked old, and there were holes in the ground and walls. However, the walls of the containment units were solid and undamaged. The Extractor dragged the Specter to a device and typed on the console. Late fanatic, the man muttered, surprised. You're quite fast for a late fanatic. The Specter didn't answer. Not very talkative, huh? The man asked. The Specter didn't answer. The man shrugged and pulled it to a containment unit. Since the Extractor didn't want to rehome the Specter in a couple of decades when it advanced into a demon, he threw it straight into a containment unit meant for demons. Also, it was safer. After throwing it in, the hero destroyed the Specter's limbs again before removing the Zephyx suppressor. I'll deal with you tomorrow, the hero said, walking out. The Specter stood in the middle of the room. Then Nick looked around. His ability had already activated again. After analyzing the containment unit, he couldn't help but smirk a little. My plan worked. Nick was now in the city. Chapter 663, Regular Work. The door opened, and Nick slowly turned to look at whoever was entering. It was the stronger of the two heroes from this manufacturer. He had told the other one that Nick would be his problem, yet he was the one who'd come in. That actually made sense. Hey, I'm the Chief Zephyx Extractor of Eternal Rest. Can you understand me? The guy asked. Nick looked at him for a couple of seconds. Yes, Nick answered. The man sighed in relief. That makes things easier. Do you know how manufacturers work? I do, Nick answered. Great, the CZE said, pleasantly surprised. That means I don't have to explain everything. Nick didn't answer. Just so we're clear, are you working for any of the corruptors? The man asked. No, Nick answered. The man looked at him for a while. Are you sure? It wouldn't be bad if you did. I've heard of the corruptors, Nick said, but I've never had contact with them, and I plan to keep it that way. Oh, how come? The man asked. Nick looked at the CZE. Because I don't want to lose my freedom, Nick answered. The CZE had a funny expression as he pointedly looked around the walls of the containment unit. Well, so much for that, he said. Nick didn't answer. Alrighty then, how can we work with you? The CZE asked. Working out terms with an intelligent Specter was far easier than with a dumb one. He could just ask. Give me 20%, Nick said. The CZE was taken aback. 20%, that's a lot. I want 20%, Nick said. The CZE shook his head. I can't do that. The most we do is 15%, and that's for a Specter that's been with us for decades and is very cooperative. 20%, Nick answered. The CZE sighed. Bang! He pulled out a long lance and destroyed Nick's lower body. Nick fell over but didn't react. Remember that you're no longer free to refuse our requests, the CZE said. I'm trying to make things easy for both of us. 20%, Nick answered. The CZE's expression turned cold. He took out a big bucket and dumped parts of Nick's body into it. The bucket shredded Nick's body and released a cloud of Zephyx. We can also just do this, the CZE said. The whole thing caused Nick only a little pain. He already had a high tolerance for it, and after becoming a Specter, over 90% of the pain he could feel had vanished. That let Nick stay stoic while his body parts were blown off. The garbage bin method, Nick answered. The CZE raised an eyebrow. You know about it. I do, Nick said. It produces less than 20% of what I could produce normally. I could ask for 70% of everything I produce, and you'd still earn more by accepting my deal. I know what I'm worth. The CZE furrowed his brows, then went silent for a while. How do you produce Zephyx? He asked. I need to know if it's worthwhile. By now, Nick's body had regrown, and he stood up. Torture, Nick said. As long as I can torture people, I can produce Zephyx. The more powerful the person, the more Zephyx I produce. The CZE looked at Nick with a bit of interest, then sighed. All right, he said, fidgeting with his barrier. His barrier activated and shrank. He held his left arm out of the barrier. Go ahead, he said. Nick walked over and summoned his blades, then began skinning the CZE's arm. The CZE was more powerful than Nick, but a sharp knife let even a normal human skin a cow. The CZE gritted his teeth, and Nick began producing Zephyx. It felt strange when most of the Zephyx was pulled out of Nick's body, like 90% of the air one breath vanishing in one's throat, minus the panic. After about a minute, the CZE pulled his mutilated arm back. That should be enough, he said, suppressing his anger. Then he wordlessly walked out of the containment unit. Half a minute later, he came back. You get your 20%, the CZE said. I already changed the settings. Nick wordlessly nodded. You know what happens if you kill any of my extractors? Yes, Nick said. Good, the man said, then walked out again, leaving Nick alone. Silence. Nick kept looking toward the door without reaction. He remained like that. He was a Specter now, and he had to act like one. Luckily, he could still practice his Zephyx manipulation in his mind, and just had to keep physical tests to a minimum. Nick essentially spaced out while aimlessly looking at the door. A couple of hours later, the door opened again. This time, the weaker hero entered. From now on, you're going to work with the Extractors by torturing their body parts, the man said. You're not allowed to attack their barriers. If even one of my Extractors gets attacked, we won't work with you again for a long time. I know, Nick answered. The Extractor nodded and held out his right arm. Nick wordlessly took out his blade and started cutting. Nick had learned some biology and knew the spots that would create the most pain. This Extractor managed to keep his arm out for over 5 minutes before pulling back, then left without a word. Extractors didn't need to talk to Specters. There was no point. Politeness and friendliness didn't influence a Specter at all. For about 15 hours, Nick spaced out. Then a new person entered, a peak specialist. He seemed nervous but not fearful, probably just worried about the pain. Wordlessly, he held out an arm. Seems like working with an arm is the standard procedure, Nick thought. Nick started on it. After 10 minutes, the Extractor pulled his arm back and left. 5 minutes later, another peak specialist appeared. 10 minutes later, they left too. For about 3 hours, Nick worked through specialists of different levels. Then nothing happened for 6 days, until he had to work with the same group again for another 3 hours. Nick watched the pattern repeat for 3 weeks. It was always the same. Seems like they've all been assigned to work with me. This is truly a city ruled by sloth. If I ever had a Specter like this in Dark Dream, I would have worked it constantly. It's so easy to work with me, and there's basically no limit. I'm essentially free money. Based on the timing, they probably each have a weekly quota, and they get through it on the first day so they can relax the rest of the week. My ability hasn't deactivated outside these work hours either. Seems like no Extractors check whether I'm still in the containment unit. Nick looked around the containment unit. Although this is one built for a demon, it'd be strange if a late fanatic broke out of it. Well, I've worked with everyone I need to for today. Time to gather some intelligence. Nick turned into mist and flew to the ceiling. Tiny holes barely 2 millimeters wide let air and light pass through the walls. They were extremely fortified, harder to destroy than most of the wall. And yet, Nick passed through them easily. The power of the containment unit didn't matter. There was a good reason Nick hadn't turned into mist while being chased by the heroes. If he'd turned to mist and still been caught, they would have known he was a force Specter and put him in a containment unit built for one. Generally, no manufacturer put physical or possession Specters into 4 Specter units. Those units cost tens of times more, for all their extra functions. Nick had been 99% sure he'd be thrown into one for physical Specters, and he'd been right. Even if he'd ended up in one for 4 Specters, he had a plan B for that too. Nick floated out of the tiny holes and into the hallway. Chapter 664, Zephology. Nick left the inside of the containment unit, but not completely. He was now between its inner and outer walls. A millimeter of free space let air flow between the two, and Nick used it to move toward a specific spot. In the past, he wouldn't have fit through such tiny openings, but his mist ability had improved a lot since becoming a Specter. He could fit through a millimeter-wide opening without using any Zephyx, and could cause real damage in mist form. He'd improved the ability by changing the manipulation lines on his Specter core, and he was nowhere near done. His abilities would only get better with time. A bit later, Nick reached the spot where the employee entrance should be. The mist wrapped around the cables and analyzed the Zephyx moving through them. This is the main line. This is the stabilizing line. This is the evacuation line. While the general functions of a containment unit were identical across cities, each city still made individual changes. Nick couldn't pin down every function, but he could see the general tendency. As expected, Nick thought, looking at one wire, there's a presence sensor. A presence sensor checked whether something was present, in this case, Nick. He hadn't completely left the containment unit yet, so he still counted as present. Presence sensors weren't hard to make. Tricking one was extremely difficult as long as you were fully inside or outside a containment unit. But Nick was between the two, essentially inside the lock. Nick cut 2 wires and connected them. Easy, he thought. Now the presence sensor gets a constant signal from the evacuation line. Very weak, but that's fine. The evacuation line was a cable that was extremely difficult to reach, probably the only one no one could reach from inside or outside. That was because it was extremely important. Its function was simple. It checked whether the main doors had received an order to open, and if they had, it sent an alarm through the entire building. The only way to reach it was through the tiny gap between the walls, which was basically impossible given how hard those walls were. A human couldn't do it. But well, I could just open the main door now, Nick thought, looking at the line that sent the open signal. I just need to put a bit of Zephyx in here, and it'll open in a couple minutes. Sadly, opening the main door instantly, without breaking the thing apart, was impossible. The signal was electric, but the delay was strictly mechanical, and the opening mechanism was encased in tough metal. After dealing with the 2 cables, Nick moved on and floated out through tiny holes near the bottom of the containment unit. He turned back into human form and looked at it. Nothing happened. Then he tapped away on the console. The only thing he could do here was open the employee entrance and check whether a Specter was present. Everything else was behind a password. Part of Nick's body turned to mist and entered the containment unit, while the rest tapped at the password field. He sent the password. The console said it was incorrect. I see, Nick thought. He tried again, while his mist body encased a couple of cables. When he sent the password for verification, the signal was intercepted, and chaotic bits of Zephyx were fed into the cable. The display read, waiting for verification for a while. Nick kept dumping in waves of Zephyx. Ding. Incorrect password. Incorrect password. Incorrect password. Incorrect password. By now, an additional wire had activated, the one that would warn against too many failed attempts. Naturally, Nick had intercepted that signal too. Incorrect password. Incorrect password. Ding. Welcome. Done. The console sent the password to the back-end verifier, which sent a yes or no signal back. Nick had infused Zephyx into the wire carrying that result. The signal shouldn't be very complex, and by dumping in random Zephyx, he was bound to hit the correct one eventually. Nick typed away on the console. This thing doesn't have many functions, he thought. Then again, those extra functions exist to help market and sell containment units. I don't think the city cares much about that. Still, the basic functions were there. Register user. Add barrier code. Nick sent Zephyx into the console's sensor, mimicking an extremely simple barrier. Proper barrier codes were thousands of signals long, impossible to crack. Nick used a 5-signal code instead. If anyone wanted to hack this containment unit, it wouldn't be hard. But Nick didn't care, it wasn't his unit. Well, it kind of was now, but that was semantics. New user registered. Employee entrance preference. Isolation. Nick changed a couple more settings. All right, let's test it. He walked to the employee entrance and sent his new user signal to the sensor. Ding. A barrier appeared behind him. He sent a different signal. Ding. The employee entrance opened. Nick walked through and stopped at a barrier on the other side. Ding. The door closed behind him and the barrier ahead opened. Nick was back inside. Employee entrances worked like other big barriers. They could be solid or liquid, by default liquid, meaning the physical door and the barrier overlapped and only let someone with a matching barrier through, like walking past a waterfall under a very strong umbrella. But they could also be switched to solid, since some extractors had abilities that emanated Zephyx similar to Specter Zephyx. Most barriers would read that as Specter Zephyx and refuse to comply. In those cases, you just created a new user and changed the barrier type to solid. Then opening and closing the entrance took 3 steps instead of one continuous motion, and the sensor stopped scanning for Specter Zephyx inside the isolated space, leaving everything to the extractor's barrier. Nick just needed to send his user data to the entrance, and it would continue the opening sequence. These functions came standard in any containment unit costing 5 million credits or more, already cheap, as such things went. The one Nick was in probably cost close to 1 billion credits. Well then, Nick thought, looking back at the entrance. He walked to it. Ding, 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 and Nick was outside again. Really glad I decided to learn Zephology, Nick thought. He was now a registered user, and could simply walk through the employee entrance despite being a Specter with no barrier. Nick turned to mist and floated out the door. He found a hallway that was oily and dirty. Sure enough, nobody bothered keeping the hallways clean, unnecessary work with no benefit. Nick floated through the quiet hallway, looking into rooms. Most were empty, but a few had people inside. Eventually, he found the office of an early specialist, a woman with unkempt brown hair, looking over papers with boredom and annoyance. Nick entered the room's walls and located the focal point where all the light converged. Then he exploded out of the hole. Bang! Her barrier broke instantly, and she collapsed. Nick blocked the room's light source, and it went pitch black. The nightmare's influence took hold of her, and Nick used his ability to control what she saw. Within minutes, he'd learned a ton about the city and the woman. Yet looking at her, he furrowed his brows. She's actually a good person. Nick remained silent, watching her. Chapter 665 of Fallen. Nick looked at the unconscious woman with furrowed brows. To think there's an actually powerful extractor in a big manufacturer who's this decent, he thought. The woman had literally never committed a crime, which was crazy. She'd had a bad past and joined a smaller manufacturer. When it wanted her to do something unsavory, she left and joined a different one. Then she just kept working, walking away whenever she saw signs of illegal activity. She felt it was stupid to do illegal things. What was the point of earning money if there was a real chance of losing it all, along with her freedom or life, within a few years? The constant nervousness of possibly getting caught also seemed too debilitating. So she just kept working normally and eventually became a specialist. The only person she'd ever hurt was a colleague who grabbed her ass. She slapped him into a wall. That was the extent of the pain she'd caused. Nick felt a bit guilty about knocking her out and forcing her through the nightmare's torture. Well, it'd be easier to kill her, but I can't justify that. Nick conjured a message and set it on the table, then vanished from the room and unblocked the light. Naturally, she would survive and wake within seconds, confused at first, before realizing someone had attacked her. Nick's message told her he hadn't killed her because she wasn't part of the city's rotten core. He worded it deliberately to seem like a zealous human chasing a goal, not a cold Specter. Nick returned to his containment unit and waited, organizing everything he'd learned. He now knew roughly where Sloth's servant was, not its exact location, but which building it should be in. The servant was called the Rot, and it belonged to Glass Ceiling, the biggest manufacturer in the city. Ding! The employee entrance opened, and the initial hero from Eternal Rest looked at Nick for a moment. Nick didn't react. Ding! The door closed and the hero left. Eternal Rest was in chaos since one of their specialists had just been attacked, and they were searching for the attacker. Nick was one of their newer Specters, and they wanted to rule out any strange power that might let him attack from inside his containment unit. Seeing him still contained, they dropped that theory. Everything was fine here. While Nick's containment unit stayed silent, the rest of the city was thrown into chaos. All the heroes and specialists searched the city. Nothing like this had happened before. Nick waited until the next work session passed, then left his containment unit again. Having gone through a large chunk of the specialist's memories, he now knew the entire layout of the city. He passed through a few small holes and left the building. Finally, Nick was out in the open, inside the city. It was surprisingly calm. There had been panic a couple of days earlier, but the city's lazy population couldn't sustain such an intense search for long. They were very good at losing motivation. Nick found the huge building that was Glass Ceiling's headquarters. Like every other manufacturer in the city, it had barely any security. The city was peaceful, and almost no manufacturer bothered another. Conflict was too stressful, so there was no point guarding against rival manufacturers. As for Specters, they couldn't enter the city in the first place. Not even Nick had managed it without alarming everyone. If not even Nick could do that, what Specter could? The magnetic field around the city was all the defense they needed against Specters. Nick floated through the building and after a while, found another specialist inside an office. Just like before, Nick quickly subdued him and used the nightmare's influence to read his memories. When he was done, Nick raised his eyebrows again. What's up with this city? Why is everyone so decent? This extractor wasn't as pure as the last, but the worst thing he'd done was sell some of the manufacturer's inventory without authorization. Yes, that broke the law, but not even Nick could justify killing him for it. Maybe he'd also intimidated people, roughed a few up, but that was really it. Not remotely like the majority of extractors, who forced tribute from the poor, sold drugs to the desperate, killed people, stole blood from the innocent, and so on. This guy was just a bit rough around the edges. Nick shook his head, left another message, and quickly went back to his containment unit. This time, nobody came to check on him. Since the incident had happened in a different building, Eternal Rest probably no longer suspected him. Nick waited another week before continuing. After reading the newest specialist's mind, he knew exactly where the rot was. Still, Nick didn't want to deal with it yet. Instead, he went to one of Glass Ceiling's offices and waited in the empty room. A couple hours later, a blue-haired woman entered with a sigh and sat down. Nick readied himself. Bang! He exploded forward, first tricking her into believing someone was knocking on the door. Her attention shifted there. Bang! Nick's blade hit her barrier with everything he had. Her face went white, but her barrier held. That alone showed how powerful she was. She was the CZE of Glass Ceiling, a mid-hero. A brutal shockwave tore from the impact, bending and ruining the walls and ceiling. The ear-grating sound of straining metal echoed through the building. Despite the surprise, she reacted quickly. But then the light in the room vanished, scrambling her perception. Boom! She summoned a sword and sliced through where Nick was supposed to be. Half the building was cut in two, rays of light pouring through the gash. Bang! Nick hit her from behind again, and this time her barrier broke. Nick was a late fanatic, and even with his ability, it took 2 hits to break a mid-hero's barrier. A late hero would probably take 4. As she lost all her Zephyx, black smoke swallowed her, blocking every trace of light. Within an instant, she was under the nightmare's influence. A maw opened beneath her, and the black cloud pulled her in, then closed and vanished. Boom! The door blew off its hinges, and 2 heroes rushed in. They stared at the wreckage in shock. What happened? Where was she? More heroes gathered outside, staring into the office through the massive cut. Search the city, one shouted. Meanwhile, the black cloud emerged from a maw inside a wall at Eternal Rest and moved into the employee entrance of a containment unit, settling into a corner. The CZE of Glass Ceiling was still suppressed inside it. Nick used the time to learn more about the city, reading through her memories with the nightmare's influence. A couple of minutes later, crunch! Her head imploded as the pressure around it intensified. I can justify killing her, Nick thought. She was the one who'd kept the doors to the rot open, letting it infect the entire city. But she hadn't done it for a nefarious reason. She hadn't even known the rot was tied to sloth. Working alongside it had made her apathetic to ambition, and she hadn't seen the harm in that mindset. She'd believed the city would grow more peaceful if people were a little less greedy. Less conflict meant less work. So she'd kept the rot's door open, and it had eventually infected the whole city. Her intentions hadn't been evil, but she was responsible for the city's current state. She'd made the decision. Nick turned her body into pure Zephyx, along with her belongings. The only things he couldn't convert were her weapons and her barrier. For those, he opened a maw portal and dumped them in, letting it spit them out somewhere random in the city. Then Nick went back to waiting. While he waited, the city went wild. The CZE of glass ceiling had been killed without anyone noticing. Had a fallen entered the city? Chapter 666. While Nick remained inside his containment unit, the city was going crazy. What the fuck was going on? One of their most powerful heroes had been killed, and no one had even seen a trace of her killer. Clearly it hadn't been a human. No one in the city could kill her that quickly. But it couldn't be a Specter either, since none could get through the magnetic field surrounding the city. Sure, they could get through, but every powerful human inside would know the moment they entered. As far as they knew, only a single Specter had entered the city in the last 2 months, and that one was safely suppressed. They checked the containment unit. Everything was fine. Besides, that one was only a late fanatic. It couldn't possibly kill a mid-hero this fast. 2 impossibilities covered every angle. It was impossible. And yet it happened. With no obvious solution left, an unlikely possibility had to be the truth. Was it truly a fallen? Had one actually entered the city? The magnetic field was technically impenetrable without alerting someone, but none of them had reached the 7th level. Nurse Alice had managed to enter a city without alerting anyone. So maybe a fallen could do something similar. But if there really was a fallen inside the city, what could they possibly do? They couldn't fight something like that. While the city panicked, Nick just waited. A couple of extractors visited to check on him, on the off chance he'd vanished. Naturally, they never expected that, but they were grasping at straws. Hours passed. Nick had no idea what was happening outside. Then at some point, his containment unit opened again. An old man with a serious expression stepped in with the city's governor. "This is our newest Specter," the governor said. The old man looked at Nick with furrowed brows. Suddenly, a voice appeared in his ears. "Hello." The old man's eyes narrowed further. This was not just any old man. Nick could tell by the uniform a judge from Aegis, a protector. It seemed the city had called Aegis for help. "How is your voice appearing in my ears?" the protector transmitted back. Transmitting one's voice wasn't unusual among powerful beings, but the specific method Nick used was shocking. This protector was old and knew a great deal about abilities and barriers. He knew Nick had to understand the accessible ports in Aegis-manufactured barriers to pull this off. How could a Specter possibly have such intimate knowledge of Aegis equipment? "I have all the answers you seek," Nick answered. "I can tell you who killed the CZE and much more about this city. I'd prefer to talk in private." The protector inspected Nick closely, while the governor watched him with confusion. Why was the protector so silent? "Leave the containment unit," the protector told the governor. Surprised, the governor hesitated, but a steely glance sent him walking out. "There," the protector transmitted once he was gone. "Thank you," Nick replied. "I'm willing to tell you everything, but you need context first. Since you won't take my word for it, I'll give you a trustworthy source instead." Nick recited a long string of digits and letters. "A database entry," the protector answered, his voice dark. Nick nodded. The protector grew more concerned by the second. This Specter didn't just know about Aegis barriers, it knew about database entries down to a specific code. "Check it and read the entry. I'll wait," Nick transmitted. The protector was baffled. A mere late fanatic knew far too much about Aegis and had no qualms revealing that it knew. Specters usually hid such knowledge, since flaunting it only made them seem more dangerous and more likely to be killed. Not only did this one know things it shouldn't, it acted almost human. Normally, the protector gave the orders. This time, he was following a Specter's instructions. "How strange." The protector wordlessly walked out. The containment unit isolated everything, so his barrier couldn't reach Aegis from inside. He had to leave first. The governor watched him with concern. "Is everything all right?" The protector didn't answer, just typed away on his barrier. Ding. Access denied, he thought in shock reading the message. He was a judge. There weren't many things he wasn't allowed to know. How had this Specter gotten its hands on such a high-level entry? While he stared at the message, a call came through. His eyes widened, a high-priority call. Only someone superior in rank could send one, and refusing was mandatory punishment. A high-priority call meant a justiciar was calling him, a peak protector. The protector vanished from the room, unwilling to take the call in front of an outsider. He reappeared outside the city, took a deep breath and accepted it. Judge Heiner, a dark female voice spoke. His face turned white with horror. Greetings, left arm, Heiner answered respectfully. How did you get your hands on this database entry? The left arm asked immediately. Heiner grew even more shocked. This was about the database entry. How high a level was it that the left arm called him herself? A Specter told me to look it up, Judge Heiner said. Describe its appearance, the left arm demanded. A late fanatic. Looks like an adult male, black hair, about 187 centimeters, very muscular. Its aura seems dark but controlled. It told me it would help with the investigation and told me to look up the entry. I see, the left arm answered evenly. Several seconds of silence passed. They felt like years to the protector. What has the Specter told you about itself? The left arm asked. Heiner thought back. The governor of Grand Extractor City told me about it, but it hasn't told me anything itself, just that it would help. That's everything. Has it given a name? No. Has it mentioned Aegis? No, but I noticed it knows a lot about Aegis and our equipment. It has an ability that accesses the free ports of Aegis barriers to transmit its voice. Silent seconds passed. Nick kept looking at the wall. Finally, the door opened and the protector stepped in. His entire aura had changed. He seemed almost uncertain. What did she say? Nick asked. The protector felt like he was in a dream. What the hell was even going on? The left arm told me to ask if you want to return, he said, confused. Nick nodded. Yes, I've been here long enough. The protector sighed. Then I'm to escort you. Nick nodded. But I have to finish my mission first. The dead chief Zephyx Extractor, right? Nick asked. Correct, you said you know what happened. I do, Nick said. I killed her. The protector was taken aback. In what killed her? Sure, strange things were happening, but that was flatly impossible. You're in a containment unit, the protector said carefully. Nick looked at him, then wordlessly walked over to the employee entrance. Ding ding. The protector's eyes widened as it opened, and Nick stepped outside. The governor stared at him in horror. What? How? Specters couldn't walk through employee entrances. Even if this thing weren't a Specter, it needed permission. Nick turned to the governor and nodded. I'm leaving with the judge. The employee entrance opened again, and the judge walked out. Okay, the governor said, perplexed. Goodbye. Nick turned to the judge. Shall we? The protector took a deep breath. What the fuck was this Specter? Chapter 667. Judge Heiner flew through the sky, carrying a big black cube. After a while, he landed in front of a humongous building, Aegis headquarters, the biggest building in the world. Though to be precise, the biggest intact one. Judging by the many ruins scattered nearby, there had once been hundreds of buildings even bigger. Compared to the glory days of the Ancient Ones, Aegis headquarters barely counted as a normal house. The Ancient Ones had achieved incomprehensible things. In the wide waters between the long continent and the Great Triangle sat a ruin of unimaginable scale, a mountain range of metal. Steel bars hundreds of meters wide and kilometers long, all collapsed onto each other into a mountain range in the middle of the ocean. Based on the composition and manufacture of these bars, this had once been a single construct over 150 kilometers long, a building roughly a kilometer wide and 150 kilometers long. Why would anyone build something that size? Some believed it had been some kind of tunnel or elevator, though no one could say where it was supposed to lead. Whatever it was for, it was clear today's technology couldn't compare to what the Ancient Ones had achieved. As Judge Heiner landed on the terrace halfway up Aegis headquarters, he glanced at the two heroes standing there. Welcome back, Judge Heiner, they said respectfully. He nodded half-heartedly and walked past them. The door opened, and orange light spilled out of the hallway. The walls and ceiling were still white, but the light was nothing like it had been 20 years ago. Back then it had been bright and full of life. Now it felt just like the sun's light. Orange dull, neutral. Things had changed. Judge Heiner carried the cube down the hallway, eventually reaching the extractor shafts. Two of them were much wider than the rest for cargo. He rode one down to the lowest level and stepped out, then walked a long hallway to a big gate. His barrier activated, and a few seconds later, 4 people stepped out of a side door. "Greetings, Judge," they said politely. "As per protocol, we need to know what you're transporting." "A late fanatic, ID, 5,117,986. One of the bailiffs typed on a console, then nodded. "Thank you. Please sign with your barrier code." Heiner's barrier activated. "Thank you, Judge." The 4 bailiffs typed on their consoles, glanced at each other, and nodded. Ding! The big door opened, and Judge Heiner stepped through. Security here was tight. The research and development area lay behind this gate, and anything extraordinary entering had to be thoroughly checked. After a short hallway, he stopped. Bang! The floor and ceiling shook with a loud slam and began to move. This was an elevator, but not an ordinary one, probably the heaviest and most secure in the world. Most elevators were small solid chambers moving through a long, mostly empty shaft. This was the opposite, an open space within one spot of a gigantic solid wheel, made of the hardest materials, almost 2 kilometers in diameter and millions of tons heavy. Whenever used, the wheel spun slowly, costing over 100 grams of Zephyx each time. 5 minutes later it stopped. A door appeared at the back and Judge Heiner stepped through. The hallway was still lit by the sun's light, though it felt noticeably darker here. After half a minute's walk, he reached a big, dirty door, pressed a small button beside it, and waited. Silence. Nearly a full minute later, the gates opened, revealing an older man with white hair and an agent's uniform. "Good evening, Judge," the man said with a polite smile, friendly, but without the deference of the bailiffs. "Good evening," Judge Heiner answered, setting the cube down. Despite the man's lower rank, Heiner was equally polite. This wasn't a normal agent. He was a researcher, working directly beneath the technician to advance humanity's technology. Not someone sent on missions. These researchers essentially lived in the underground labs, spending their whole existence on research. They were the brains behind humanity's brawn, with privileges to match. Messing with a researcher was one of the stupidest things a human could do. "I brought Specter 5,117,986, Judge Heiner said. The researcher's barrier activated, and Judge Heiner watched vast quantities of windows pop up on it, a barrier at least 10 times more expensive than his own. "Everything looks to be in order," the researcher said, smiling. Heiner's barrier then showed a message granting him a coupon for a mobile Specter cage from the equipment storage. Obviously, the researchers meant to keep the cube. They wouldn't let a Specter walk freely through the research area. "Thank you," the researcher said, lifting the cube. Heiner nodded and headed to a smaller door leading back to the normal hallway. They wouldn't move the gigantic wheel again just for him. The researcher carried the cube into the research area as the gate closed behind him. The space was filled with complex, gigantic machinery, over 20 people experimenting with various things. This was only the storage and entrance section, where big but mobile machinery got tested. The hall was about 100 meters wide, yet represented only about 10% of the whole department. He crossed the hall into a hallway, walked a bit further, and stopped at a huge gate. His barrier activated, windows flickering in and out. Ding! The door's barrier deactivated, and it slowly opened onto a disorderly office. Papers, machines, and objects strewn everywhere without rhyme or reason. "Ah, George," a man said, popping his head up from behind a big machine. "Is that number 5,117,986? "Yes," George answered, setting the cube down. "Perfect," the man said, grinning. "I've been waiting for this." This was the technician. George nodded and turned to leave. "Wait a second." "Yes," George stopped and turned back. "Your specialty is spectology, right?" "Yes." "Want to see what's inside?" the technician asked with a grin. George was intrigued. This was something even the technician found interesting. "If I'm allowed." The technician nodded. "Your thesis on the overarching theorem of Specter Zephyx generation is basically already accepted as fact in the department. You're new, but I think you could bring fresh perspective. Want to be my assistant on this project?" George's eyes widened. An assistant on one of the technician's projects. That was crazy. A genuine smile broke across his face. "Gladly." The technician smiled back, and a long contract appeared on George's barrier. George read through it and took a deep breath, very restrictive but expected. This research was top secret. If anything leaked, people would die to the envious researcher. George signed it. 5,117,986 is a specter that feeds on pure suffering. It doesn't matter how it's inflicted, the technician said. George was already hooked. It feeds on pure suffering. Yep, as long as someone suffers, it grows stronger. George frowned, then went quiet for a moment. It seems my thesis wasn't completely correct. Oh, how come? The technician asked, already knowing. My theory was that every specter causes suffering in its own individual way. Based on my math and how Zephyx works, it shouldn't be possible for a naturally occurring specter to generate Zephyx directly via the base model. It's like the number 0, it technically exists, but also doesn't. The technician's smile widened. You're right, you said naturally occurring. This isn't a natural specter. George was taken aback again. This isn't a natural specter. I'll show you. The technician opened the cube. The door swung wide and Nick stepped out and immediately looked at George. George looked back, both of them equally surprised. The technician noticed their expressions. What, you two know each other? Nick, George asked. Ghosty, Nick asked back. Chapter 668. Nick and Ghosty looked at each other, both plainly surprised. Ghosty had expected to look at a specter. Nick hadn't expected anyone to already know about his new status. Seeing their reactions, the technician scratched the back of his head awkwardly. Windows popped up on his barrier, and a second later he sighed. I really should read up more, he said. You should, Nick answered. Ghosty was a bit surprised Nick spoke this casually to the technician. Researchers talked casually with him since he didn't care for performative politeness, but people generally didn't take that tone with a shield. The technician kept scratching his head as he looked at Ghosty. He hadn't planned to reveal Nick's full identity to his new assistant. He'd meant to just say Nick was an artificial specter, not that he'd once been human or had already worked for Aegis. But since the two already knew each other, that plan was dead. He shrugged. Well, whatever. You signed the research contract anyway. Maybe that's even a good thing. Naturally, he'd rather Ghosty not know all this, but the cat was out of the bag. Might as well live with it. Sensing the technician's decision, Ghosty felt some relief. It hadn't been obvious from outside, but getting rid of him had genuinely been on the table. If the risk of him knowing this secret outweighed his future contributions, disposing of him would have made economic sense. Having come to terms with his new lease on life, Ghosty turned his focus to Nick. So you're a specter, right? Nick glanced at him with furrowed brows, and Ghosty felt his mind flash a fear response, which he found fascinating. The last time they'd met, Nick had been an initial expert and Ghosty a peak specialist. Now Ghosty was an initial hero, well on his way to early hero. And yet he could tell Nick was a genuine danger to him, dangerous enough to make him feel almost helpless. Even so, his powerful mind kept full control while he watched his own feelings with pure fascination. This was so interesting. Nick glanced at the technician who just shrugged. The damage was done. Yes, I'm a specter, Nick answered. Interesting, Ghosty said, stepping closer and looking him over with furrowed brows, as if searching for scratches on a new research object. Have you always been a specter? No, Nick said. The last time we met I was still human. A light appeared in Ghosty's eyes. It had been ages since anything had fascinated him this much. So you turned into one. Nick glanced at the technician again. It's fine, the technician said. Tell him everything. Just don't drop huge secrets without build-up. If you're talking about things that should stay secret, I still want the chance to interrupt. And keep the maw descriptions to a minimum. Nick nodded. He'd never gotten instructions to be dramatic for safety reasons before. After you left Crimson City, I became the liaison. Nick told Ghosty about his 5 years as liaison. Ghosty had lost all contact with Crimson City once it was on the other side of the planet, so hearing what it had become nearly broke his belief. Yes, it all made logical sense. Yes, it was theoretically possible, but that wasn't how things usually turned out. Countless things could have gone wrong. When one person hoarded that much power, things nearly always turned for the worse. Unchecked power was extremely dangerous. There was a good reason governors weren't strong enough to destroy their own cities in a fight. If Aegis wanted that, they'd have made the agents governors and the governors agents. Sure, in theory a benevolent dictator could accomplish more than a benevolent group, but that was theory. It just didn't happen that way. What, a man who clawed his way to the top of the power ladder turned out selfish and indifferent to others. Shocking. And yet Nick had actually made the hypothetical real, fighting to improve the lives of the poor, risking his life against the elite, and actually winning. Ghosty felt like he was listening to a fairy tale. How had this actually happened? After Crimson City, Nick briefly mentioned his time in the trainee camp, though it wasn't especially relevant. Then he got to his consumption, and when Ghosty heard he'd tried to consume a peak elder, he refused to believe it. That was physically impossible, like competing against a theoretical frictionless machine using a real one full of imperfections. One had 100% efficiency, the other had to fight countless small interferences. But hearing how the consumption had ended, Ghosty realized it actually was possible if the Specter conceded. No one had ever managed to make one concede before. When Nick described his Zephyx synchronizer being encased by a Specter core, Ghosty peppered him with questions, until Nick pointed out none of these thought experiments mattered anymore. That wasn't the current state of things. Finally, Nick mentioned the maw, leaving out almost 90% of what surrounded it. By now the technician was interested too. He hadn't been able to experiment on Nick since the fusion. Nick could barely finish a sentence before another question hit him. After about 30 minutes of nothing but questions, Nick realized this wasn't the priority. "Technician," he said, "we can talk about all this later. Some things need more immediate attention." For a split second, the technician was flabbergasted, something more important than his research. But he quickly saw Nick was right. "Right," he said, sighing, "politics." Nick nodded. The technician glanced at Ghosty, who understood immediately and stepped out of the room. Now it was just Nick and the technician. "All right," the technician said, "you've been undercover, right?" Nick nodded, then told him about accidentally coming into contact with Wrath, everything he knew about Wrath, and his job as its assassin. "That's quite smart," the technician said. "You cleared out other influences, planted your own, and now you can remove that influence in one strike. We can deal with almost 10 demons at once, and they won't get a chance to prepare or react." Nick nodded. "I know exactly who's working for Wrath and which humans are knowingly allied with it. Whenever Aegis discovered a city secretly controlled by a corruptor, it always mattered whether the governor had known. Governors were at least early heroes, and killing an innocent one was very bad. But sparing a guilty one risked letting the city fall under a corruptor's control again, this time better hidden." "What about Grand Extractor City?" the technician asked. "What about it?" "It seems different from the other cities. You said one of your main reasons for doing Wrath's work was improving people's lives. Introducing Wrath to Grand Extractor City doesn't sound like it did that. I can think of a few reasons, but I want the real one." "Several reasons," Nick said. "First, I wanted to knock out one of the biggest bastions of a corruptor that opens them up to attacks from the others. More conflict means a better chance Aegis notices the chaos and uncovers the corruption. Second, I was already planning to return to Aegis. Dealing with the city first meant it'd already be cleaned up by the time I made contact, or I could contact Aegis mid-mission instead, same result, just more investigation on their end." Third, Nick said, eyes narrowing, "they're selfish." Chapter 669. "Selfish?" the technician asked with interest. He could already guess what Nick meant but wanted to hear him say it. "The normal people here don't live in conditions most would call great, but these are the conditions they've chosen," Nick said. "This isn't powerlessness, it's a voluntary choice. In that case, they don't suffer much. In terms of happiness, this city is probably one of the best." "But they're not contributing to humanity," Nick added. The technician gestured for him to continue, genuinely curious about Nick's ideology and feelings as a Specter. Could Nick still feel things? Was he lying? Why was he making these choices? Was he still thinking like a human? "Humans want two things, to stay alive and to be happy," Nick said. "Some prefer survival over happiness. They'd rather live 80 years in poor conditions than die early. Others would rather die young and happy than old and miserable. Both groups can live however they want, but humanity as a whole still needs to survive. It's your choice not to have children and to burn through your money before dying young, but if everyone acted like you, happiness would die out with your generation. Does that mean you have to have children? Of course not. But while you have power over your own life and lineage, humanity as a whole must still ensure it keeps existing." Grand Extractor City was happy, but it also has several mid and even late heroes with the power to help far more people, and they just sit there doing nothing. That's the fancy moral explanation, Nick added. More accurately, I just hate people who take without giving. If anyone argues that they're a city and don't need to help anyone outside it, I have a simple answer. Fine, don't help Aegis, keep your Zephyx, and Aegis will leave you on your own. Watch your city get enslaved by some random fallen within a year. Let's see how happy and independent you are then, Nick said with cold annoyance. The technician nodded a few times, studying him. Nick's arguments were logical, but there were clear signs of emotion and bias behind them. In short, he sounded like a human. All right, the technician said. Would you mind giving me a written record of all the cities and any people of note? Nick nodded, but before he could start conjuring papers, the technician smiled smugly and set a small device on a nearby table. Try this. Nick raised a brow and touched it. It looked a bit like a barrier, but not quite. A moment later, a screen projected into the air in front of him, the same kind Aegis barriers used. Writing with these screens wasn't easy, since they read the Zephyx waves one gave off, but mastering it made writing much faster. Nick's Zephyx wasn't human, so it shouldn't have interacted with the device at all, but since the technician told him to try, he did. The screen distorted briefly, then letters began to appear. Nick glanced at the technician's smug smile, then grabbed the device, turned it over and pried open the casing without damaging it. He could make out how a few components worked, but most of it was beyond him. He knew a fair amount about zephology, but that didn't make him an engineer. Still, every machine boiled down to physics in the end, and some parts were easier to read than others. You removed the input security, Nick said, a bit surprised. The technician was glad Nick could tell. Not needing to explain the basics meant less work and more enjoyment. Yeah, seemed like the easiest way to get it working for a Specter. Nick studied the rest. He didn't know what most parts did, but he knew removing the input security alone wasn't enough. Every part expected specific readings and values, and running different Zephyx through it was like powering an electrical circuit with water instead of electricity. Nearly everything would need to change for it to work. Nick looked it over a while longer, then reassembled it. Asking the technician to explain would eat up hours. Instead, he activated the device and tried writing. He'd been able to write on such devices before becoming a Specter, and though he had to adapt his new Zephyx output, his experience manipulating Zephyx made it easy. Within 2 minutes, he had it down. While Nick relearned to write, the technician jotted his own notes on his barrier. Once Nick had the hang of it, he wrote several pages of records on every city he'd interacted with. When he finished, the device blinked and transmitted everything to the technician's barrier. The technician read it in a second and nodded with interest. This will be a big hit to Wrath. I'll send it to Helia, she'll deal with it. He did just that, then turned back to Nick. Now then with this out of. Ding, ding, ding. His barrier rang and he furrowed his brows. Of course, he muttered. The left arm. That's strange, Nick thought. Last time I saw them talk it was voice transmission. Why barriers now? Yes, all of this is accurate. Yes, he's here. Yes, right in front of me. Say hi, Nick. A small light appeared in Nick's eyes. Greetings, left arm. Yes, 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 no, yes, great, sure, yes. The technician rolled his eyes. I don't know, why are you asking me? No, no, yes, what? Oh, no, yeah, okay, sure. Ding. He hung up and sighed again. Anyway, that part's over. She'll handle all the cities. Nick nodded. What did she say? Anything about how we proceed from here? The technician scratched the back of his head. Things are a bit different these days. We can't really make big plans right now. Adaptability matters more than a plan. He sounded casual, but Nick could tell the current Aegis wasn't easy to navigate. Why did you communicate through barriers? This room is isolated, the technician answered, unsurprised Nick had noticed. Isolated? Nick looked around, then noticed the light was a bit off, not quite sunlight, not quite the champion of light's light either. Artificial light, he thought. He also couldn't sense anything outside the room. Only 2 things connected it to the outside world, the door and a Zephyx receiver embedded in the wall. Yes, I know what question's coming next, the technician said with an annoyed sigh. Nick just looked at him evenly, waiting. Things are not easy right now, the technician said. I presume you've heard of the new champion of light. Nick had already guessed this connected to that. The new champion's words seemed different from the old ones. He nodded. Let's just say the fundamentals of the world aren't as clear-cut as you might believe. Chapter 670. Nick couldn't be sure what the technician meant. That could mean almost anything. The technician seemed to be wrestling with himself over what to tell Nick and what to keep secret. "I can't tell you much," he said. "These secrets are even more sensitive than the nightmare's location. It's not that I don't trust you, I don't trust your power. There are ways to read your mind or reactions that you can't resist. You're like a lockbox made of wood. I trust you not to open yourself up, but I can't trust you to survive a big guy with a big hammer." Nick nodded. The technician kept turning over what to say and what to withhold. It wasn't easy. "How would you define Aegis?" he suddenly asked. Nick furrowed his brows. "An alliance of the strongest people on the planet who want to help humanity as a whole." "Good definition. Basically correct, remember that." Nick waited for more, but the technician seemed done. "That's it." "Yeah, I've decided not to tell you anything. Telling you anything's already too risky. All I can do is reassure you that Aegis has humanity's good in mind. Aegis wants humanity to survive and wants to get rid of every external threat to it. Keep that in mind." Nick just looked at him. He'd never doubted Aegis' mission as far as he'd seen. It genuinely wanted to protect and help humanity. He should already know how I feel about this, Nick thought. Yet he keeps repeating that I should remember Aegis wants to protect humanity, almost like he's afraid I'll see something that makes me doubt it. Nick's eyes narrowed. That's when he noticed the technician's smile looked nervous, forced, like a man afraid of being caught in a lie. But was the technician really such a bad liar that he couldn't control his own expression? Sadly, that was entirely possible. He was a researcher, not a politician or a leader. But he was also extremely old and experienced. So was this expression deliberate or truly accidental? Was he afraid of something? If so, of what? "He just genuinely wants to help humanity," the technician said again. "Please never doubt that, okay?" Nick just looked at him. "Can we drop the topic now?" he asked, nervous. "Sure," Nick answered. The technician sighed in relief, his good mood returning. "Anyway, Helia will come up with a plan and contact us again. She'll make it look like everything you've gathered came from a top-secret mission run by a group of underground agents. You won't get credit for any of it." Nick nodded. "That's fine. Most people would complain this was unfair, they'd done all this, they deserved recognition. But Nick wasn't interested in that. He wanted to help humanity, and he had. He wouldn't turn down a reward, but he wouldn't ask for one either. Until that's settled, you'll be staying in here, this room specifically. Then we'll figure out how to move forward. For now, we wait," the technician said. "Fine," Nick answered. His interested smile returned. "Good. With the boring stuff out of the way, how have your abilities changed?" They spent a while discussing Nick's abilities in depth. "Oh right," the technician said, activating his barrier briefly. "I totally forgot." Nick wasn't sure what he meant until the door opened and Ghosty walked in, his assistant on this project, now that the sensitive material had already been covered. They kept asking about Nick's abilities and how they'd changed. Then Ghosty asked, "We keep talking about your secondary abilities, but how has this?" "Stop," Nick said sharply, cutting him off. Ghosty froze, taken aback. The technician looked between them and immediately understood. "Oh," he turned to Ghosty, "you know about his primary ability." Ghosty nodded, then quickly realized why Nick had stopped him and looked at the technician with a raised brow. "You don't." The technician furrowed his brows. "Right, I remember now," he said, scratching his chin. "That's the real reason I asked you here. Well, that and you being a good researcher." Silence. The mood turned awkward, though everyone present was sharp enough to navigate it. "You don't need to tell me," the technician said, "but I still have one question. Consider it my way of making peace with never knowing." Nick and Ghosty nodded. "The old champion of light told us never to ask about his ability. Why?" he asked Ghosty. Ghosty was surprised the champion had said that. Several things clicked together in his mind and his mood turned somber. He hoped he was wrong. "If I may ask," Ghosty said, "what was the old champion's opinion of Nick?" Nick furrowed his brows, realizing his earlier answer on this hadn't been the whole truth. He'd believed the champion forbade the question to protect him. The more people who knew about his ability, the more likely he'd die. But now, he gave him the last name Dusk, the technician said. Ghosty took a deep breath. His suspicion had been confirmed. "I think I know why," he said. The technician looked at him. Ghosty seemed solemn. "It's to protect you," he said. Nick nodded. He just realized the same thing. "To protect me?" the technician asked. "My ability is extremely powerful," Nick said, "but it has a devastating counter. Knowing about it could weaken me to 1/10 of my power. If the champion's hope ever comes to pass, he trailed off. The technician sighed. Having people around who know about your ability is a danger, since the enemy might learn it too. If you ever reach that level of power, your survival will matter so much more than my worth as a researcher and shield. Nick nodded. Like Aegis, I want to protect humanity. No individual's desires outweigh humanity's collective ones. Ghosty didn't know Nick well, but the technician had spent years with him, and as far as he knew Nick, nobody spoke, they all understood. If Nick became a shield and truly wanted to help humanity, the smartest move would be to kill everyone who knew his weakness. For Ghosty, that didn't matter, he'd only become a hero with Aegis' help and knew he'd never become a protector. By the time Nick could become a shield, Ghosty would already be dead of old age. But the technician was a shield, and not one of the old ones, he belonged to the younger half. Well, if that's the reason, I'm relieved, the technician said, suddenly casual. The other two raised their brows. This proves the champion of light believes in Nick, enough to proactively protect the other shields from his future power. It also proves he believes Nick will still want to help humanity once he's powerful. The technician looked genuinely relieved. All right, so, what's your main ability? Ghosty's eyebrows shot up, and Nick furrowed his own. The technician knew exactly what he was asking. I gained my ability by interacting with the null, Nick said without hesitation. An uncomfortable look crossed Ghosty's face, too late now. But why had Nick told him, without a moment's hesitation? The technician just smiled, delighted. An Eternal's ability, fascinating. Nick told him freely because he admired him. The technician was willing to sacrifice part of his own life to help humanity, just like Nick. Refusing to honor that sacrifice would have felt disrespectful. Chapter 671. Ghosty, the technician, and Nick kept experimenting on him for several days. While they did, thousands of people had their lives turned upside down. Bang! 5 people landed in front of a thick gate inside a huge mountain. The guards wanted to sound an alarm, but froze in shock at their uniforms. Aegis agents. Welcome, Age. Shut up, a woman with short red hair said, glaring. Both guards froze, not daring to make a sound. Move, she commanded, and they jumped aside. A younger man in the group stepped forward without a word. His barrier activated, windows popping open and closing, and the barrier over the gate deactivated, letting it open. Every city built its own inventions, but the basics of barrier tech came from Aegis, and Aegis could crack any barrier. The 5 entered. The guards controlling the gates and barriers inside the mountain froze in shock when the machinery stopped obeying them, but didn't dare protest once they saw the uniforms. Aegis. The inner door opened, revealing the city. Black Mine City. It looked pretty normal, people living normal lives, businesses, families, work. The only odd note was fewer poor people than expected. That was it. This didn't look like a city under a corruptor's control. This group of agents specialized in investigating cities for corruption. There were several ways such an investigation got triggered: a governor's request, a caravan's request, another group of agents, or a superior acting on some random tip. Most of the time, there was nothing. These investigations were time-consuming and tied up resources, so there were real consequences for sending a team somewhere that turned out clean. Most investigations went nowhere anyway. 4 of the 5 grew annoyed looking at the city. This looked like another waste of time. It obviously wasn't corrupted. Yet their red-haired leader looked confident. Seeing her team's expressions, she pulled out a huge folder of documents. Their eyes widened at its size. That was a lot of information. Usually these folders were much smaller. Matt, isolate the city. Nobody leaves. Shouldn't be hard here, she ordered. Yes, a tall, thin man said, shooting into the air inside the cave. Chelsea, Miranda, take Vertigo Box and Swirling Abyss. The 2 biggest manufacturers over there and there. 3 heroes each. Yes, they shouted and vanished. Yuri and you. As always, the blonde man asked with a casual smirk. No, she answered flatly. We go straight to execution. Urian let out an impressed whistle. Alrighty then. He vanished, and the leader turned her gaze to a seemingly random cave. Shing. She appeared in front of it in an instant. Bang. The gate caved in as if some invisible giant had pushed it. Boom. The mountain shook, the cave nearly collapsing, and an almost invisible gigantic hand pulled a figure out, a tall woman with 3 heads and 6 arms, struggling in its grip. At the same moment, Blinding lightning tore out of a building across the city. The red-haired leader recorded everything as it happened. After a few seconds, the giant hand brought the Specter closer. "Are you willing to tell us anything about Wrath in exchange for your life?" she asked. The three heads seemed to argue among themselves. "Yes," the middle head said finally. She nodded and pulled out a space bag. Several Zephyx suppressors floated out and bound themselves around the Specter. "Job's done," Urian said, reappearing behind her. Nothing unusual, dropped like a sack. The leader nodded. The governor was dead. Her barrier changed, and Urian's activated on its own. During the critical parts of a mission, these teams disabled communication between their barriers. Some Specters could feel the connections between barriers. They might not decipher them, but they could sense their presence, which could warn a Specter something was wrong. A sufficiently corrupted city might sense it too, and while it couldn't hurt the agents, it could hide evidence. But with Wrath's servant and the governor both dealt with, the two biggest dangers were gone, and there was nothing left to unmask. "Gather every hero and specialist in the city in one place," the leader ordered. Confirmations came in from the rest of her team. Within minutes, every specialist and hero stood gathered in the city center, and the leader had the Specter undo the mental manipulation it had caused. A few hours later, a new hero entered, an early hero ready to prove himself as governor, already trained on how to run a city. The agents forwarded all relevant information to him and ordered the manufacturers to hand over everything they had on the city. Within 2 days, the agents left again. Despite giving them plenty on Wrath, the Specter was thrown into the Crimson Sea anyway, the left arm's orders. While this played out, several other cities underwent the same treatment. Every city Nick had conquered for Wrath got turned upside down by a team of agents. Even Grand Extractor City was hit. A few cities in the raid were ones Nick had never touched. He simply knew about them through his contact with Wrath. Wrath's mistake had been assuming Nick was a Specter through and through. He was a Specter, but he didn't think or act like one. 16 cities were hit. Nick had only been involved in about half. Roughly a quarter of the rest already belonged to Wrath without his help, and the remainder belonged to other corruptors, options Nick could have picked instead of Grand Extractor City. Around 200,000 people had been affected by the raid, 200,000 freed of Specter influence. Nick had given Wrath a real foothold in the Grand Continent, then taken away far more. Almost every city Wrath controlled there was liberated, pushed all the way back into the war continent. Decades of progress gone. Wrath knew exactly who was responsible: Nick. It was angry, but only because anger was its base emotion, not because of anything Nick had specifically done. After all, this meant Aegis had captured Nick, and like any Specter, he'd talked. This was exactly the danger that made Wrath tell its servants only about the cities they were each involved in. Nick had been special, he'd touched so many. Wrath had hoped he'd be killed, or would still fear it enough to hold back from Aegis. Nick should have known that the more damage he did to humanity, the more likely Aegis was to kill him. Telling Aegis everything was stupid. Wrath had assumed he'd be smart enough to see that. He obviously hadn't. Sadly, things hadn't gone the way Wrath wanted, but none of it mattered in the end. Wrath had been alive for over 1,000 years. Setbacks were normal. Eventually, it would cause enough suffering to become an adversary. It just had to keep going. A week after all the cities were liberated, the left arm contacted the technician again. She'd come up with a plan for the future. Chapter 672. A group of 7 people stood in a circle, looking at each other. 3 were physically present. The other 4 appeared as projections on big glass panels. Helia Janus, codename the left arm, present. Line secured via presence of the champion, she spoke from one side of the room. Her black hair and older face gave her an intense aura of leadership as she glanced to her left. The man beside her scratched the back of his head awkwardly, white hair unkempt. James Cloudless, codename the technician, present. Line secured via presence of the champion. He looked to the hologram on his left, a man almost 2 meters tall, voluminous in a way that might have been muscle. He smiled with a mix of mirth and confidence, hands on his hips. Berenimus Hosh, codename the Wall, present. Line secured via Grade S isolation barrier. Elaborate on the isolation barrier, the left arm ordered. The Wall sighed helplessly but complied, spending 30 seconds on his barrier's settings and standards. Acknowledged, she said. Then everyone turned to the next hologram, a girl who could barely be 10, dirty and malnourished, but radiant with white hair and a bright smile. Henrietta Opfer, codename The knife. Present. Line secured via direct link through Grade A stronghold conference barrier, she said casually, elaborating on her connection without waiting to be asked. Everyone already knew how these barriers worked. The point of reciting the security details was to prove each speaker was truly who they claimed, different key phrases depending on where they connected, used as authentication. These were the shields of Aegis, discussing top-secret matters. Aegis enemies included extremely powerful Specters, some able to use human equipment and pass as human. No Specter could be allowed to infiltrate a meeting like this. Acknowledged, the left arm said, turning to the next hologram, a man in his mid-20s, black hair, as serious as the left arm herself. In a way, he looked like a younger, male version of her. Mendes Silphian, codename, the politician. Present. Line secured via Grade S isolation barrier, he said flatly, then spent half a minute on his own barrier before falling silent. Acknowledged. She turned to the next, a taller blond man, about 185 centimeters, stalwart and muscular, in shining armor. One of only two people not wearing an Aegis uniform. His aura was reliable, powerful, heroic. Byron Inferno, codename the right arm. Present. Line secured via Grade A stronghold conference barrier, he said, authoritative but encouraging, then went through his own security details. It wasn't enough to just repeat someone else's phrases. Each person had to speak four fitting ones, none already used. Acknowledged. Finally, she turned to the person on her right, who was also to the right arm's left. Only one person could sit between them both. Everyone is present, champion, the left arm said respectfully. Good, a booming voice answered. It came from a figure shining with dark orange light, white hair, early 30s, an angular face with eyebrows like swords. His voice filled the room with authority. His aura spoke of one thing only, the top, the leader, the peak, the king. He was the champion of light, leader of all humanity, the other person not wearing Aegis uniform. Instead, he wore a white shirt and form-fitting black trousers, like an executive dressing down. The monthly conference hereby begins, he said, turning to his right. Byron, what news from your side? Every month, the Shields held a conference to exchange information, meetings that hadn't existed before this champion took over. When he'd first arrived to claim his throne, he'd been infuriated by the chaos of conflicting reports, as if the right hand had no idea what the left was doing. Ever since, every Shield reported here monthly. I've pinpointed the Eternal Hunger's location to an area spanning 10,000 square kilometers, the right arm said. I'll keep narrowing it without being found. The champion nodded seriously. Have you decided its fate? Not yet, champion. Killing the Eternal Hunger would let life return to the outside world, but without its deterrent effect, the False Hope would become nearly unstoppable. The Eternal Hunger and the False Hope were probably the two best-known adversaries. The Eternal Hunger spawned countless black slimes that attacked anything living. The False Hope grew false forests that killed anything that stepped inside. The two warred constantly, since they preyed on the same thing. No hope of containment, the champion asked. I'd need Helia and Berenimus's help, and for a while. The champion's eyes narrowed at the ground. Risky. Not worth it, he said finally. I'll leave it to you. The right arm nodded. That left killing it, or forcing the two adversaries into a final conflict. If he could pinpoint both locations, he could steer them toward each other. No guarantee either would die, but both would weaken, and the chaos might open a door for Aegis. That was all he had for the month. The politician spoke next, reporting on his work gathering data on Zephyx production worldwide, tracking which regions produced least, and scouting new settlement sites. Then the knife took her turn. She held no leadership role, just a powerful assassin whose job was hunting humanity's enemies. She'd been the one to find Pestilence's whereabouts a couple years back, though that mission had gone nowhere. The wall went next, essentially the knife's opposite, with a vast array of defensive abilities meant to protect humanity from the adversaries. He wasn't strong enough to beat them outright, but he could stall until the knife arrived. Together, the two of them were stronger than the left arm and right arm combined. Then the technician, reporting on HR and research. Finally, the left arm. We've freed 16 cities in the Grand Continent from Specter influence, she said. The others stared surprised. That was a lot. How, the champion asked. She didn't answer immediately. James and I have been running a secret project for a couple of decades, she said. This is the result of it. The technician smiled sheepishly, scratching his head. The others looked at her. Secret projects were frowned upon. There was no reason to keep secrets among themselves. "You know our policy," the champion said, reprimanding. "I do," she answered, "but if I'd told you before there were results, you'd have told me to stop." "Silence." "Explain," the champion ordered. She took a breath. "We have a Specter as an ally." Chapter 673. The room fell silent. The right arm's eyes narrowed. The politician looked at her with suspicion. The wall and the knife looked unhappy. "I have not been informed of this," the champion said, deep voice flat. "The project's been running 20 years. We just needed to wait for results. There were more important things to deal with," the left arm said, unapologetic. "Why?" the right arm asked. "This makes no sense. You've always been the most adamant about never trusting Specters." "That's correct," she answered. "And I still don't trust any Specter. This one might be called an ally, but it has none of our trust. It's a weapon." The mood in the room curdled further. The initial shock gave way to real anger and betrayal. Allying with a Specter was idiotic. It was an ironclad rule. Specters were humanity's natural enemy. Worst of all, it was the left arm who'd fallen for this, the shrewdest of them all, thorough, rarely wrong. The only reason nobody called her an idiot outright was how outstanding she was at everything else. "The only reason I'm giving you a chance to explain is that I don't believe you'd make such a stupid mistake," the champion said. "You've always struck me as thorough and careful." "Thank you, champion. Now tell me everything. We need details." The others watched her with skepticism. 29 years ago, I received a report from a city north of the desolate continent," she said. "From Simon Francium, one of the judges keeping Envy contained. He found a Specter in a city he'd visited during an emergency. Surprisingly, the Specter willingly revealed its true identity. It was actively seeking contact with Aegis upper ranks." The others looked doubtful. This didn't sound plausible. "This is Simon Francium's report," she said, transmitting it. The shields read through it in seconds. Naturally, she'd forged it. "I told James to investigate the Specter and make sense of its behavior. Here's his report," she said, sending another. That one was forged too by the technician himself, forging his own report. It was insanely long and detailed, though the shields tore through it just as fast. "Abnormal psyche," the politician noted on one page. "Yes," the left arm said. "This Specter's psyche is abnormal in that its emotions are surprisingly human." "For a Specter, that's insanity," she went on. "For a human, it'd barely register." "I'll add," the technician cut in, "that powerful extractors could all be called slightly insane. It's practically a requirement for getting that strong." Some of the shields frowned but couldn't argue. They all had their quirks. "If this were just a random Specter, I'd guarantee cooperating with it would hurt humanity. But it's not. This Specter has goals." "Goals?" the knife snorted. "Besides maximizing suffering." "Yes, it wants to become the strongest Specter." The others furrowed their brows. This was different. Other Specters chased suffering and grew strong as a side effect. This one aimed directly for strength. "Why?" the champion asked. "The same reason any human wants to be the strongest," she said. "Greed and ambition." "Like a businessman," the politician said. She nodded wordlessly. "And why does that change our dynamic with it?" the right arm asked. "Because it doesn't see humans as prey," she explained. "It sees us as a business offering something it wants to buy. It let itself get captured to strike a deal with Aegis. It's willing to work for us." Silence. "In exchange for what?" the wall asked. "In exchange for working for us." The wall looked surprised. The knife raised an eyebrow. A light of understanding appeared in the politician's eyes. "I see," he muttered. "By working for us," she continued, "it helps us, but it also gains power. Specters grow stronger by causing suffering. But a Specter inside a containment unit still produces Zephyx and strengthens Extractors. It causes some suffering, but the benefit outweighs the cost, or we wouldn't work with them at all. And Specters don't weaken by helping humanity. This one knows that very well and wants to exploit it. About 20 years ago, I sent it to infiltrate the most chaotic region of the Grand Continent, to work its way into a corruptor's ranks for years and use what it learned to hand Aegis a devastating opening. 16 cities, over 200,000 citizens, 20 dead demon servants. That's what it delivered. It joined Wrath, conquered several cities belonging to gluttony, sloth, and lust, and exposed their inner workings from the inside. We pushed Wrath all the way back into the war continent because of this Specter alone. During that mission, it advanced from peak elder to late fanatic." Several of them frowned. That was fast, it must have caused enormous suffering. But as she went into detail, they realized the Specter had actually improved conditions in nearly every city it touched. Suffering had dropped sharply, with what little remained funneled onto the Specter itself. It had stolen effectively all the suffering from wrath, eliminated 80 to 90% of it, and kept the rest for itself, cutting overall suffering while badly weakening wrath. It made economic sense, good business for both sides. Looking at the numbers, none of them could dispute it. Aegis had genuinely benefited. In the future, the champion asked, every Specter ultimately benefits from humanity's suffering. Specters are our enemies. I might once have said the sun was our ally. We know now that wasn't true. It says it doesn't want to become our enemy, the left arm said. It says quality matters more than quantity. The suffering of one shield is worth more to it than the suffering of millions of ordinary people. It wants power, and it needs powerful humans to get it. We want power too, and we need Specters for that. If it ever becomes an adversary, it's willing to keep working with us. We'd grow stronger without needing the false prophet, and it would grow stronger too. If we can make it powerful enough, we could raise the level of every shield. It might even be the key to rivaling the Eternals. It calls itself not a parasite but a symbiote. Silence. The shields weren't sure what to make of it. It all made sense technically, but it sounded like a sales pitch. Would it really play out this way? It sounded too good to be true. James, your opinion. You've been working with it, the right arm said, looking to the technician. He shrugged. I don't see anything wrong with it, sounds good to me. You're not worried about betrayal once it's powerful enough, the right arm asked. Nah, the technician said. That fear assumes we do nothing while it grows. It's not becoming unstoppable overnight, and we're not trusting it blindly. We'll keep watching it, and if it looks unstable or too dangerous, we can still stop it. By the time it's anywhere near becoming a fallen, we'll all already be watching it constantly. We can still stop it then. Killing it now would just waste the opportunity. Silence. I want to meet it, the champion said. The others furrowed their brows, then nodded. The left arm turned to the technician. Bring it in. Sure thing, he said and walked out. Chapter 674. About a minute later, the door opened again. Nick entered the Champion of Light's hall for the second time in his life. Just as before, everything was bright and majestic, the imposing throne visible at the back. The only real difference, no one sat on it. Instead, the new Champion of Light stood shining in the circle with the other shields, his back to his own throne. Nick looked over the holograms. The technician had already briefed him on the others. The wall was jolly and relaxed, genuinely enjoyed helping people. The knife was shrewd and clever, acting childish to make others lower their guard. The politician was the serious, thorough type. The right arm was a natural leader, Aegis' public face since the champion couldn't leave headquarters, charismatic, strong, reliable, gifted at rallying people. As for the new Champion of Light himself, the technician had said only that he was the most powerful person alive and the leader of Aegis. That was it. The near-total silence on the subject was itself information. Nick had played the political game long enough to catch a deliberate gap. Sadly, an absence of information wasn't very informative. All Nick could tell was that something was off about the new champion. What he had no idea. He could be a Specter, a greedy human, a genuine ally, anything. Nick was only sure something didn't add up. He stopped outside the circle, not being a shield, he couldn't join it. Everyone looked at him. They could all feel his true nature. A Specter, he really was a Specter. Greetings, Nick said, bowing slightly. My name is Julian Winter. The left arm and the technician showed no reaction to the name. Nick couldn't use his old one anymore. The technician had told him his meeting with the original Champion of Light was secret, known only to the dead champion, the left arm, and the technician. That champion had gone back into stasis until his successor appeared, and the other two had kept it to themselves. Only Simon Francium also knew, and only about the meeting itself and Nick's first job as liaison. In the database, Nick Dusk was still listed as liaison, last recorded as taken by the Maw and missing since. He was very likely presumed dead, killed by the Maw. If Nick used his real name, the other shields would search the database and find the match, exposing him as a former human. So he needed a new name entirely. In the end, he combined the two biggest influences on his life. Parents shaped most people the most, but Nick had none to speak of. He didn't even remember them. The two people who'd left the deepest mark were Julian Nerger and Wintor Melfian, fittingly, one human and one Specter. The name was also untraceable. There were hundreds of Julians in the world, and Winter wasn't an uncommon surname either. Nick Dusk would remain his true identity, but he'd go only by Julian Winter from now on. He'd never forget the name the original champion had given him. Dusk, the lowering of the sun. Nick had come from the humblest origins. He hadn't even had a name at first, until every poor soul in the Dregs started calling him nickname. Each of his names carried meaning. Nick, his beginning. Dusk, his goal and hopefully his future. Winter, his first friend who'd given him a shot at changing his fate. Julian, his teacher, mentor, and enemy. Julian Winter was born, but Nick Dusk wasn't dead, just hibernating. One day Nick Dusk would return and Julian Winter would die. "How did you get that name?" the politician asked. "I gave it to myself." "How did you come up with it?" The question seemed pointless on its face, but the shields could tell the politician was testing him. Lying to a shield was extremely hard for anyone several levels below one, and he wanted to catch Nick off guard, probing for cracks in the disguise. "The first part comes from someone who taught me Specters don't need to oppose humanity. The second comes from the first person whose life I infiltrated. I was still young when I met either of them." "I'm responsible for both their deaths," Nick said. The right arm glanced at him. "Do you regret that they died?" "No." His brows furrowed. "Why not? They sound important to you." "They were my enemies." "Who else is your enemy?" The right arm pressed. "It." "I think we're getting sidetracked," the wall said with a calming laugh. "It was the champion who asked for Julian." The right arm and the politician glanced at him, then turned back to the champion, signaling they were done. The champion had said nothing this whole time, just watching Nick. "Your aura is familiar," he said slowly. Nick didn't answer. The other shields looked at the champion with surprise and interest. Nick stayed outwardly calm, nervous underneath. "I've never seen this guy before," he thought. "You were one of the Specters I pushed back when I took the throne." Nick remembered that speech and the attack that followed. He wanted to sigh in relief but kept himself in check. "I remember," he said respectfully. "Where were you that day?" "In a cave outside Waterpillar City." Barriers flickered across the room as the shields checked the location. "That's one of the cities he liberated," the technician said. "He?" the politician asked, suspicious. "Yes, him. Who else?" the technician said, confused. The politician was faintly annoyed, though nothing showed. "Since when do we assign genders to Specters?" The technician groaned. "Who cares how I refer to him? I've worked with him a while. He sounds like a guy, looks like a guy, acts like one. I just went with he." The politician studied him a moment longer, then let it go. "Tell us about Waterpillar City," the champion ordered. A relatively big city, formerly controlled by gluttony. 90% of the people were nearly dying of thirst, while the other 10% swam in pools. The strongest specter there is the water pillar. It grows more powerful by consuming water. "How did you take control?" "I systematically assassinated every owner of the water trading companies, demanding water prices drop sharply if they wanted to keep living. Then I kept damaging the biggest manufacturer until they had no choice but to comply. Finally, I weakened them further and stirred up conflict between them and the rest of the city." "I have a detailed report," the left arm said, sending it to everyone. They read through it instantly, far longer than Nick's summary. His own account had sounded simple, almost like something a child could dream up. The actual report told a different story, precise, thorough planning. "You assassinated a hero as a mid-fanatic," the knife asked, surprised. "How did you get this strong?" Chapter 675. "I have the unique advantage of being a Specter with human education and training," Nick answered calmly. "Every other Specter has to learn everything alone, with no formal combat training. In my first couple of years, I focused on learning fighting with a weapon, staying hidden, assassination, how different technologies work. My status as a Specter gives me unique advantages there." "Enough to assassinate someone several levels above you?" the knife asked, suspicious. Nick nodded. "As long as my attack is strong enough to burn through nearly all of a human's Zephyx, their raw power stops mattering. Without Zephyx, a human can't even move. A barrier is a brilliant invention. It wins 99 fights out of 100. But it's also exploitable if the enemy understands how it works. Others don't know how barriers work. I do." "If I may demonstrate," Nick said, glancing at the champion for permission. The champion nodded. The shields watched, brows furrowed. A light appeared in the champion's eyes. "Its voice bypassed my barrier and went straight into my ear," he said. The others were startled. That method required intricate knowledge of Aegis barriers. Several shot annoyed looks at the technician. It was obvious who'd been careless enough to teach a Specter that trick. He threw up his hands. What? I've just been watching him. It's the open ports. Anyone who knows barriers can access those. They're called open for a reason. Fine, the knife said, brows still furrowed. But how do you get enough power to destroy a barrier in an instant? I'm sorry, Nick said politely, but I'm not comfortable sharing my abilities. Abilities? The politician repeated with emphasis. Nick nodded. I have a primary ability, and since I have a Specter core instead of a Zephyx synchronizer, I also have an edge in Zephyx manipulation. I've built a few secondary abilities, not especially powerful, but perfectly suited for assassination. My skill set is narrow. If an enemy senses me before I strike, my power is barely above an average Specter's. I'm good at fighting. I'm exceptional at assassination. The knife said nothing, just watched him with suspicion and interest. Can you confirm its power? The champion asked the left arm. Yes. He nodded, studying Nick a while longer. Why should we accept your help? I believe my abilities can serve Aegis well, Nick said. As a Specter, I have attributes humans can't replicate. With my help, Aegis gains new options for handling other Specters. I understand you may see me as a threat, that's the trade-off here. But that threat is only real if I'm overseen only by humans of similar power to mine. I might fool a lone specialist or hero, but now all 7 shields know me and are watching me with suspicion. I don't believe I could do any real damage to Aegis before I was erased. The shields considered him. One thing was clear, he was good at selling himself. That might be true now, the wall said friendly, but what about the future? Could you specify? What if you grow powerful enough to fool us, hypothetically? That's possible, Nick answered. But if you allow me to reach that kind of power, our partnership will already be interlinked deeply enough that severing it would cost far more than it gains. I'm here because I believe I can achieve more working with humanity than fighting it. If I wanted to rule everything, I'd need to kill every powerful human, which means destroying the very thing that lets me keep growing. I once read a phrase about killing the chicken that lays golden eggs just for its meat. I'm not sure I have the wording exactly right, but it makes the point. Destroying or enslaving humanity would be short-sighted. I'm a Specter. If I want power, I need powerful humans. Weakening humanity destabilizes my own path to power. Why would you care? The politician asked. You're a Specter. About the path to power thing. The politician didn't answer, but that was clearly what he meant. Because I don't want my existence to be meaningless, Nick said. As a Specter, I'm not bound by things like longevity. The only way I die is violently. And after death, everyone's the same, no more feelings, which means you can't even register the life you lived. You can't enjoy looking back on the empire you built, and you can't regret dying alone with nobody remembering your name. Once you're dead, none of it matters, because you feel no consequences. What is a finite stretch of light against an infinity of darkness? 1 in 1 billion are equally far from infinity. So it doesn't matter how I live. It's meaningless either way unless I can achieve eternity. That's what I'm trying to do. The shields watched him with interest. For a Specter, this sounded surprisingly human, which was rather the point of pressing him this hard, to probe whether he had a real personality or was simply insane. A normal Specter would have no personality at all, or none worth the name. But the way Nick argued carried real human complexity, distinct values and opinions. You want to become an eternal, the champion said. No, Nick answered. That's not enough. The chance of dying never truly disappears until nothing is left that could kill me. Becoming an eternal still leaves an equal out there. The champion's eyes narrowed. You want to be stronger than the sun. Nick nodded. That's my goal. If you had the power, what would you do to the sun? This was the trickiest question yet. Nick knew the champion was different somehow, but not how. Was it smarter to say he'd want it dead or leave it be? That's not my decision to make, Nick said. I'll be working with humanity. My goal is eternity. The sun's existence has no bearing on that. I could go either way. But I need humanity as an ally to get anywhere near that goal, and humanity may have its own opinion on the sun's fate. To honor that partnership, I'd leave the judgment to humanity. The champion studied him a while longer. Very well, he said finally. You've made your case and I see your value. For now, I'll permit your cooperation with Aegis. Nick bowed. Thank you, champion. The champion turned to the left arm. Continue the experiment. Use the Specter however you see fit. She nodded without answering. But, he added, it is not human. Not even humans can always be trusted as allies of humanity. A Specter can be trusted even less. Of course, she said, I'll never let my guard down. He nodded solemnly. Keep me informed on this project. She nodded again. The champion looked at Nick a few seconds longer. For now, we're willing to help you. Make sure we don't change our minds. Nick bowed. I'll do my best. Leave. Nick turned and walked slowly out of the room. Chapter 676. A man landed on a platform atop a gigantic building, a full kilometer long and 300 meters high. Impressive dimensions for a normal building, though they barely qualified as a megastructure by Aegis standards, which required one dimension of at least a kilometer, a second past 100 meters, and a third past 10. This structure was one of Aegis' strongholds. Aside from headquarters, Aegis maintained 12 of them worldwide, each serving as the regional command for its zone: the northwestern edge of the Great Triangle, the middle of the Long Continent, the middle of the Western Grand Continent, the middle of the contested zone where Nick had operated for years, the middle of the Long Triangle at the Grand Continent's southern edge, near its eastern edge, close to the Long Island beyond it, the middle of its north, the middle of the War Continent's north, the middle of its south, the middle of the southern continent, one of the islands housing Crimson City, southeast of the Grand Continent and north of the Desolate Continent, and one near the Desolate Continent's northeastern edge, built solely to contain Envy. This stronghold sat near the eastern edge of the Grand Continent. The man who landed wore long black robes hiding his entire body, tall black hair blowing in the wind. A white, featureless mask covered his face. Altogether, he looked strange. The two guards atop the building narrowed their eyes the instant he landed. They could see and sense him, but something was off. His presence felt artificial. Wrong. Identify yourself immediately, one shouted, a mid-hero with black hair and a serious expression. The other guard was a middle-aged woman with blood-red hair. The man slowly turned to face the one who'd shouted. A black barrier flickered around him for a second, and the guard's barriers displayed his information. They read it and frowned. Name guest, first name guest, power guest, position guest. The only field that wasn't filled with guest was entry permission, set at the level of an agent. They checked the readout several times. Strange as it was, the data confirmed it was deliberate. Apologies, the black-haired man said. We meant no disrespect. The red-haired woman gave a slight bow. The masked man activated his own black barrier, and moments later the guards' black barriers lit up with a message they could barely stomach without exploding. A complaint by an agent-level figure has been lodged against you. Your sentence will be extended by 5 years. 5 years. 5 more years standing guard atop this building, licking the boots of whoever wandered by. They hadn't even done anything wrong. Their job was to investigate suspicious visitors, and if this guy wasn't suspicious, no one was. Yet doing everything correctly had just cost them 5 years. This wasn't fair. Not fun being on the receiving end, is it? A distorted voice came through their barriers. They both fought to keep from exploding in anger. No, sir, the black-haired man said with a forced smile. Only governors who'd abused their authority were sentenced to guard duty in places like this. Jasmine Redon, the distorted voice said, the mask turning toward the red-haired woman. Marcus Julius, it said, turning to the black-haired man. They waited for more. Instead, the figure simply turned away. Think about what you've done, the voice said, and mist poured from his hands and feet as he rose into the sky and flew off. Shock gave way to rage. Why had he even come? Was extending their sentences his entire purpose here? They were furious and baffled, until, within a few days, most of the confusion cleared. Visitors reported the same masked figure appearing at every other stronghold, apparently doing nothing but extending guard sentences. A few words from this stranger had condemned over 20 heroes to another 5 years each, something as effortless as turning over a hand for him, and devastating for them. Some of the guards couldn't help noticing the irony. This was essentially what they themselves had done to their own former citizens. A few careless words from a governor, and hundreds had died needlessly in their cities. Any day now, Marcus Julius thought, frustration mixed with anger and hope. Any day now they'll relieve me of this humiliating duty and send me back to Crimson City. I was a good governor. I did the right thing. Running a city better than I did is nearly impossible. His eyes narrowed, especially not by some lowborn nobody from the Dregs. Nick will fail soon and they'll call me back. My innocence will be proven. Any day now, soon. These had been Marcus Julius's thoughts for over 20 years, but soon, very soon, they'd bring him back. He was sure of it. This couldn't be the rest of his life. Meanwhile, the masked figure landed atop Aegis headquarters. The two guards there stood rigidly still and didn't engage as he passed. He'd extended their sentences too. He entered the building and made his way to the research department. Ding! The fortified door opened at his black barrier's touch, and he stepped through. "Everything good, mystery man," one researcher called with a grin. The figure just waved as he passed. He'd been coming and going here for over a year, and though the researchers knew nothing about him, they'd grown fond of him regardless, never a word out of him, just the nickname they'd settled on. None of them suspected they were talking to a Specter. The mystery man entered the section reserved for the technician. "They all went through," the technician said, scanning a few windows on his barrier. The mystery man swept a hand over his mask, and it vanished. "Nick, of course. The Zephyx generation strong," he noted. "I'd assume so," the technician said. "They're probably cursing your existence with their whole hearts." He glanced at a small display in the corner. 3,247 grams per hour total. That's insane for a late fanatic. Over the past year, the technician, Ghosty, and Nick had focused their work entirely on him. A fully cooperative Specter with an excellent human education accelerated their progress dramatically. Among their breakthroughs, rerouting the prefix Nick absorbed during Zephyx generation through different media. Containment units normally needed contact with the outside atmosphere to let prefix in, but the new technique routed it through solid matter more conductive to prefix than air, cutting the cost of 4 Specter containment units significantly. They'd also learned to measure Zephyx output with far more precision. Some Specters could hide part of their production, making it look smaller than it was. Not anymore. And with that, the technician said, smiling, the Diet Specter barrier is fully functional. Chapter 677. The Diet Specter barrier, a name the technician had given it himself. One of their biggest projects had been building a barrier with the same functionality as a standard Aegis barrier, but usable by a Specter. Aegis barriers packed in a surprising number of functions, which was why the prototype took so long. A year wasn't much time for ordinary people, but a year from the world's best researcher was a great deal. Originally, the plan was to make it identical to a normal barrier, but the left arm vetoed that. She secretly saw Nick as human and supported him, but couldn't let that show. She had to look like she believed he was a full Specter she distrusted. So she forced the technician to make any Specter barrier visibly distinct. A different color, black, permanently fixed unless the barrier was destroyed and rebuilt from scratch. Every attribute besides ownership permissions had to read as abnormal, hence the technician just filling every field with guessed. Together, these made Nick's barrier impossible to overlook, which was the point. No Specter should move through human society without raising eyebrows. Left Arm even ordered every Specter barrier to log its activity to her and the technician, but he wriggled out of implementing it by complaining about the workload, since there was only one such barrier in existence anyway. In private, the two of them had already worked this all out. The friction was just a smokescreen, making her look draconian and him look like he just wanted to relax, so it seemed like the two of them cooperated while still genuinely disagreeing. The researchers had seen the black barrier a few times without much surprise. They didn't know what the color meant, and prototypes looking different from standard models was normal. Thanks to the Specter barrier, Nick could move through human society again. 2 functions were missing though. The first was database access. For security, no Specter barrier could reach the database directly. If a Specter needed information, an Aegis member had to relay it. Mostly theater, since Nick had free access to a terminal in the technician's office where Ghosty stayed logged in, letting him read whatever he wanted anyway. The second missing function was the most important one on a normal barrier: protection. Building a connection fast enough to absorb Zephyx from a Specter at a speed that could block a serious blow was extremely difficult. As things stood, any attack draining more than 10% of Nick's Zephyx would collapse his barrier outright. Fixing that would take a long time. Fortunately, it didn't matter much for Specters anyway. A serious hit to human's head, neck, or upper chest killed almost instantly. A Specter only died when its core took serious damage, and unlike a human, a Specter could relocate its core. If Nick expected a massive attack to his upper body, he could shift his core down to a foot. Even if everything above his waist was blown apart, he'd regenerate and survive. Regrowing lost flesh was usually more Zephyx efficient than blocking the attack with a barrier anyway. Apart from those 2 gaps, the Diet Specter barrier could do everything a normal one could. The Diet, in the name, referred to the missing defenses, the one thing that made barriers so essential to humans in the first place. If you can file complaints, you can basically do everything else too, the technician said with a smirk, scrolling through numbers on his barrier. Oddly, extending a former governor's sentence carried the most safety checks of anything Nick could do, since it pinged every department involved, each demanding its own identity verification. Nick just nodded. "How's the camouflage work going?" the technician asked. "We're on it," Nick said, meaning himself and Ghosty. The technician handled the technical side while Ghosty focused on Zephyx manipulation. Ghosty knew more about it than the average governor, but he wasn't a real authority. Any random protector outranked him there. Still, the technician was fully absorbed in the technology side and had no time to spare for it himself. He simply called Nick in whenever he needed a test subject, then sent him off again while he kept theorizing alone. Of course, barriers weren't his only focus. As far as the technician was concerned, the topic was closed the moment Nick could interact with human society through his. His main focus now was zephology. Manufacturing powerful materials required gigantic, advanced machinery. The more powerful the material, the more advanced the machine needed to be. Materials were ranked by durability. Rank 1 carried no Zephyx at all, while Rank 9 could theoretically suppress an Eternal. The most powerful ones that actually existed were Rank 8, producible only at Aegis headquarters and only by the technician personally. The machine that made them was over 20 meters wide and devoured a ridiculous amount of Zephyx to produce even a small quantity, and the process was extremely slow. People who heard about it marveled at the technological achievement. Anyone who actually saw the machine and knew a bit of zephology would be horrified instead. It was a chaotic mess, wiring as tangled as an organism's veins, with no function localized to any one spot. Everything seemed to happen everywhere on the device at once. The truth was that humanity technically wasn't advanced enough to have built something like this yet. The machine was so complex that the technician himself sometimes forgot what the first half of a calculation had been for before he finished the second. Like someone who wandered so far off on tangents, they lost the thread of their own sentence. He spent much of his time boosting the machine's output, while about 20 researchers worked on isolating parts of it into smaller machines that could be shipped to individual cities and strongholds. But all of it would become obsolete the moment Nick mastered conjuring materials himself. That was what interested the technician most. He kept working on a way to translate different materials into terms Nick could use to conjure them directly. Pull that off, and Nick could produce extremely advanced materials on demand, or the technician could teach other Specters the same trick and build something like a Specter material factory. This new approach wouldn't rival the old machine's most advanced output for decades, but it had far more potential and scalability, and would eventually make the old method obsolete. Cheaper materials meant cheaper devices, meant extractors and manufacturers buying more gadgets. Right now, most cities could only mass-produce Rank 3 materials, the reason most city walls could only stop adults. Even so, building and maintaining those walls drained their economies. Rank 4 materials were within reach too, though not in bulk. 90% went straight into containment units built to suppress elders. Very few cities could produce their own Rank 5 materials at all. Crimson City had been one, thanks to Ghosty. Any city that couldn't produce a material had to buy it from Aegis, and that was expensive. Chapter 678. Another year passed. Nick spent it researching with Ghosty and the technician on conjuring materials and zephology, Ghosty on Zephyx manipulation. Nick had just turned 70, which left him with a brief feeling of disconnect from reality. It felt like he'd been a liaison only a year or two ago, and his time in Crimson City felt shorter still, since he'd lost so many memories of it. He remembered sitting in on the other Extractors' meetings in Blitz's room. 70 had seemed so old back then. Now he was 70 himself, and still considered extremely young for his level. Nick had just become a peak fanatic, equivalent to a peak specialist. Specialists who survived to old age generally lived past 300. The average person became an initial specialist around 130, and most never made peak specialist at all. Those with the talent to eventually become heroes usually hit peak specialist around 200, but only if they'd consumed an early elder during their consumption. Those who managed a mid-elder had protector-level talent and averaged 170. Almost nothing was known about the rare few who'd consumed a late elder, except that they were considered to have shield-level talent, though nobody was sure if every shield had actually managed a late elder, or if some had only managed a mid one. By the math, they probably hit peak specialist around 140. Nick was half that age. and yet he was already ancient by normal standards. The older he grew, the more distant normal humans seemed. Most never reached their 50s. The wealthy occasionally made it to their 60s, but usually died in their 50s, and the wealthy were a tiny minority to begin with. Ordinary people rarely reached 50 at all. Most died in their early 40s from their unhealthy surroundings. In the outer city of Crimson City, for instance, people spent their whole lives too close to unsafe materials, breathing rust and toxic industrial chemicals, sometimes Zephyx waste dumped by manufacturers. None of it kind to a normal body. The poor often died in their late 20s or early 30s, worn down by a lifetime without enough water, food, clean air, or rest. Nick was 70, an age nearly impossible even for the wealthy. That made the deaths of so many young people feel almost meaningless to him. But he could feel that thought creeping in, and he always fought it. If I stop caring about ordinary people, I'll have become the very thing I've hated my whole life. He kept telling himself that. Their lives might be short, but they're bright. They deserve a good life just as much as any extractor who lives for centuries. He'd already noticed how much harder it had become to feel empathy for ordinary people. His mind still simulated the feeling, highlighted it, walked through the motions, but his heart didn't conjure it on its own nearly as often. The technician and Nick suspected this came from constant exposure to Specter Zephyx dictating his thoughts. His mind and soul now lived in his Specter core, not his brain. The finding confirmed a theory Ghosty had developed. Ghosty was the one who'd proven that Specters grew stronger by causing humans suffering specifically. But why? Why suffering, and why only humanity? There were Specters that preyed only on plants and animals, true, but a series of experiments had turned up something odd. Many Specters fed on plants inedible to humans, but those plants were always just one step removed from something a human could eat. As long as some other creature could eat the plant, and that creature was in turn edible to humans, the Specter still generated Zephyx from it. Add one more layer of separation, and the effect vanished entirely. Such plants barely existed naturally, so they'd had to be engineered for the experiments, and the longer the tests ran, the more conclusive the pattern became. A plant that had to be eaten by another plant, in turn eaten by a poisonous insect, in turn eaten by one specific mammal, produced no Zephyx at all when fed to any Specter. Not even the eternal hunger could draw anything from it, despite the plant being every bit as alive as the rest. The only real difference was how hard it was for a human to ever benefit from it. The implication was chilling. Specters seemed to exist purely to cause suffering to humanity specifically. But why suffering, and why humanity? Answering that was the goal of Ghosty's latest theory, built around prefix. No one knew exactly how it happened, only that Specters simply came into being when enough prefix fused together. The how and why remained a mystery. Ghosty's theory assigned the Specter's purpose to prefix itself. If Specters were just condensed prefix, and Specters existed to make humanity suffer, maybe prefix itself existed for the same reason. Logical as it sounded, too many holes remained. Why was prefix everywhere? Where did it come from? Why did it never run out? And most importantly, if prefix existed only to make humanity suffer, why did using it make humans so much more powerful? Ghosty didn't have an answer yet, but if the theory held, it would explain why Nick's empathy had faded so much. Specters didn't feel empathy, and if prefix itself was humanity's enemy, constant contact with Specter Zephyx would naturally breed apathy toward humans. The technician, Ghosty, and Nick all watched his mental state carefully, taking regular notes and reminding him of his original goals and past feelings. Nick had been born human, and he was now a Specter. It mattered that he didn't become one in mind and soul as well. If that ever happened, he'd simply be another Specter. Someday Nick might forget what it felt like to be human. The last flicker of empathy might fade decades or centuries from now. But as long as his ideology, his logic, his sense of self stayed intact, his personality would remain human. He might become someone incapable of empathy, but he'd still be human. Plenty of people were born without much capacity for empathy and were still kind to others, not because they felt obligated to be decent, but because they wanted to be. Nick agreed with that. Even as a Specter, he wanted to stay human in mind. His whole speech about eternity in front of the champion of light had been bullshit. Nick didn't want to die, but he didn't actually care about eternity. He just wanted to be a decent human being. Sure, he was working to redeem himself, and by the look of things, he'd manage that reasonably soon. But what came after he'd helped 1,000,000 people? He remembered the helplessness and fury of watching a rich man in the Dregs casually buy something worth more than Nick's entire life. He remembered looking around the Dregs, feeling powerless, while people who actually could change things simply refused to. He'd sworn back then that he'd never become like them. He still remembered that oath. He might forget how to feel empathy. He might forget happiness or what companionship felt like. But he would never forget that oath or what it meant to be a decent human being. Still, he feared the future, feared his mind changing, feared that despite everything, he'd eventually become a true Specter regardless. All he could do was keep remembering his past and his true self. Everything else would have to wait. Right now, Nick's main focus was mastering camouflage. Just a couple of months after becoming a peak fanatic, he finally developed an ability that could fool nearly every extractor into believing he was human. He could already move through society, technically, but people still picked up a Specter vibe from him. The only reason he hadn't been apprehended already was that a handful of humans gave off similar vibes from unusual abilities. But that leniency only applied at Aegis headquarters and strongholds. Any ordinary city would have tried to contain him on sight. I can camouflage myself now and I have a barrier, Nick thought. Finally, I can be useful to Aegis again. Chapter 679. Nick stood in a dark cave, watching what unfolded in front of him. A shadowy figure with 4 long arms activated a stone circle, a major relay, though not one contacting Wrath. The largest stone shifted shape into the figure of a woman in the prime of her life, dressed in the most extravagant clothing Nick had ever seen, her gaze sweeping the cave with pride and arrogance. "Mistress Pride," the shadowy figure said respectfully, dropping to its knees. Pride barely acknowledged it. After a long silence, she scoffed. "You've been followed," she said with disgust. Nick's camouflage ability had already deactivated the instant Pride appeared, but he still didn't move or make a sound. The shadowy figure looked around frantically and found nothing. It was alone in the cavern. Pride watched her useless servant search in disgust, then sent a message into Nick's mind, a single concept: dominance. Nick was genuinely impressed by how powerful that feeling was, like standing before a peak fallen with no way to resist. Of course, that wasn't the truth. Pride's perception remained formidable, but summoned through a major relay, she could barely project real power. At most, she could threaten a veteran like this. Nick knew all of that, and yet. A cloud of fog gathered out of nowhere into a floating ball of mist. The shadowy figure eyed it with interest, a force specter. Once fully formed, Nick sent back a feeling of submission. Pride looked at the mist with disgust, giving up that fast. Yes, she knew she was impressive, but it annoyed her that the thing hadn't even tried to resist. "I won't punish you for your mistake," she told the shadowy figure. "It brought me another servant." The figure bowed deeper, though privately it was just annoyed. Everyone here was a Specter. What was the point of punishment when Specters barely felt emotion or pain? The only real punishment Pride could inflict was death, and both of them knew she wouldn't kill it just for being followed. That would be a ridiculous waste of resources. Too much pride, ironically, was a liability. The 7 corruptors all counted as intelligent Specters with altered mental states, in short, insane. Wrath stayed constantly angry, and that anger regularly clouded its judgment, driving it to reckless decisions. Nick had barely met envy, but it seemed consumed by greed for everything, overextending itself again and again, which was exactly how it had ended up trapped in its current predicament. Pride, for her part, was consumed by pride itself, always needing to dominate, throwing her weight around in displays of power, like a teenager endlessly bragging about how she could beat up everyone else. She really could beat up almost everyone, but saying so constantly changed nothing. There was no point threatening the shadowy figure further. A moment later, Pride sent Nick another feeling. "What are you?" Nick sent back a question. Was he allowed to demonstrate? Pride snorted, then sent an affirmative. Nick had no intention of ever revealing his intelligence, or that he could take physical form. The 7 corruptors were rivals, but death had forced them into an alliance, with rules governing their conflict, one being that servants couldn't switch allegiances. Whenever a corruptor gained a new servant, its identity was shared with the others. When Nick became Wrath's servant, his identity had gone out to them all. If he appeared in human form now, Pride would simply try to kill him. He wouldn't be in real danger. She was only an early fanatic here, but it would waste an opportunity to help humanity. With her go-ahead, Nick turned to the shadowy figure. She wanted a demonstration. "Whom?" Nick surged forward and enveloped its body. The figure realized what was happening and tried to defend itself. Bang! A blinding flash of light lit the cave, and Pride lost her sense of Nick entirely, unable to send a signal to stop him. At the same moment, His arms materialized with blades and sliced the figure apart. So fast it looked like the mist had grown 10 arms. "Stop!" The instant Pride could sense him again, she ordered him to halt with everything she had. Nick obediently flew back and stilled. Looking at the ground, Pride sneered in disgust. Weakling. The shadowy figure was already crumbling into black dust, its specter core splitting apart. "Dead?" She turned on Nick. "Are you betraying me?" she demanded, sending a wave of pure fury. The mist ball shrank back in submission, sending only confusion and a plea not to be killed. "I did not allow you to kill my servant." More confusion, more pleading, a chaotic barrage. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, but why? But why? I'm sorry, but why? I'm sorry, but why?" Pride regarded the pathetic ball of mist with pure disgust. "No matter," she said. "You're too stupid to understand what you've done. This is exactly why I hate Force Specters." There wasn't a single intelligent Force Specter anywhere in the world, so it never occurred to her that Nick was acting. Her own arrogance made the possibility unthinkable. Who could possibly fool her? "I have a job for you," she said. Nick sent back waves of eager compliance. He just didn't want to die. "Wait here." He nodded mentally, over and over. Pride scoffed and the major relay deactivated. Silence returned, the cloud of mist hovering alone in the cave. "Guess I'm in," Nick thought. Pride's getting too powerful. If she takes the whole long continent, she could become an adversary. The corruptors' infighting eats up a lot of their attention and resources. The more they fight each other, the less they focus on humans. They're still using us, sure, but at least they're not doing what death actually wants, wiping humanity out entirely. We can't let them unite. Weakening Pride was the job the left arm had given him. The shields were leaning on her hard. They wanted proof that accepting Nick as an ally was paying off. Nobody had the luxury of just sitting around growing stronger in peace. Humanity was desperately outmatched in manpower and resources compared to the Specters, and everyone with power had to pitch in. Countless talented extractors could have grown far stronger given time to train, but Aegis couldn't spare them that time. Humanity lived in a constant state of emergency, and the shields regularly had to choose which cities to save, since there simply weren't enough hands to save them all. Wrath and envy pressed on lust, and sloth couldn't expand much since 90% of its borders touched its ally lust. What little room it had for offense went into fighting gluttony. Everyone stayed locked in constant battle. Pride, meanwhile, was steadily swallowing the long continent, since envy couldn't mount a real defense. Dealing with her was a priority. After a few minutes, Nick sensed someone approaching, a dark-haired man with serious eyes, carrying a trace of Specter Zephyx. Likely Pride's servant, assigned as Nick's handler given his supposed stupidity. Seeing how convincingly human the servant looked, Nick almost smirked. He really does look human. Shame if I accidentally mistook him for one and killed him. The misty cloud vanished from view. The black-haired man entered the cave and looked around. Mist gathered behind him, blades materializing. His eyes widened too late. He was dead within a second. Whoops, Nick thought. Chapter 680. Nick waited. Minutes passed. Hours passed. He did nothing, just hovered in the middle of the cave. Days passed. He was bored, but this was the job. He could handle it. Eventually, his camouflage ability deactivated, and Nick immediately tensed. Someone was watching him, and he couldn't find the source. Still, he didn't move. After a few seconds, a loose violet robe floated into the cave, drifting slowly toward him. Nick had noticed it the moment it appeared at the entrance. Can't tell how powerful this Specter is, he thought. It's like it gives off no Zephyx at all. One thing was certain. This Specter was powerful. The fact that it had watched him quietly before calmly floating in on its own meant intelligence, ruling out a Force Specter or a Possession Specter. This was a physical Specter. A physical Specter that could hide from Nick's perception, sharpened as it was by his contact with the Maw, had to be extraordinarily strong. About what I expected, Nick thought. The only reason he hadn't already fled was the shield of incompetence and stupidity he was hiding behind. He sent the robe a vague feeling of inquisitiveness. Are you the servant of that powerful Specter? The answer came quickly. What happened to the other servant? The robe transmitted. What other servant? Nick sent back, not actual words, since even a dumb Force Specter capable of coherent feelings was already unusually smart. The robe described the human that had appeared days earlier. Human food, Nick answered. No, that was a Specter. But it's human. It was a Specter that looked like a human. But it's human. It gave off Specter Zephyx. Some humans do that. Silence. Did you gain any Zephyx from killing it? The robe asked. No, weird human. How could you gain no Zephyx if it was human? Silence. Nick let several seconds pass. No Zephyx, no human, he answered, feeding it a tangle of confused feelings, as if genuinely struggling to work it out. No human, he repeated. Moving object look like human. No, it's a Specter, the robe answered calmly, seemingly with infinite patience. Specter, Nick sent. No human Specter, but Specter, why human? To hide within human society. Not everyone hides as well as you. Human Specter, Specter look like human look like Specter. What Specter? What human? What attack? What not attack? What food, what food, what food? Silence, the robe let him work through it on his own. Everything food, Nick finally offered. Everything is food. Human eat food, Specter eat no food. Human not eat no food, Specter not eat no food, eat food, not eat not food, everything food. The robe considered him for a while, then floated over to the major relay the shadowy Specter had left behind and activated it. Pride manifested again, her gaze landing on Nick with disgust before shifting to the robe. Report. It thought the Specter was human and ate it. Why? Because it looked human. Simple and dumb. Pride understood immediately how a dumb force Specter could reach that conclusion. For all her arrogance, she knew incompetence was almost always the likelier explanation over malice. Still, something nagged at her. I sent an early demon, she said. The robe studied Nick more closely. A peak fanatic, quite a jump. And after the first strike, the old servant should have had time to transmit a warning, realizing the human it was attacking was actually a Specter. The only way Nick could have killed it so cleanly was overwhelming power that gave it no chance to react. Something didn't add up. Was this force Specter really that strong? Test it, Pride ordered. As you wish. The robe turned to Nick and ordered him to attack. I don't want to die, was the gist of Nick's reply. Attack me with everything you have, or I'll kill you, the robe transmitted evenly. Whom? Nick shot forward and closed the distance in an instant. Bang! He unleashed 90% of his Zephyx in a blinding blast, then followed with roughly half his physical strength, holding back his true power, which would have been absurd overkill, though even half of it was nothing to scoff at. The robe took a few shallow, superficial cuts and didn't break anywhere. Nick could tell it wasn't even resisting. It was simply letting itself get hit and barely registering the damage. This robe was extremely powerful, at least a late demon, possibly a peak demon, possibly even a fallen. After his attacks landed, Nick deliberately dumped the rest of his Zephyx into light. Bang! The mist burst apart, revealing a black crystal that fell to the ground, trembling his Specter core, behaving exactly as a true force Specters would. Back when he'd been human, his mist form had been one of his greatest weaknesses. A single hit while misted would have killed him. As a Specter, that had changed entirely. A human couldn't survive on just a brain or just a heart alone. The whole interconnected system was required. A Specter needed only its core. When Nick took hits in mist form, it felt like watching pieces of his body get blown away, fatal for a human, survivable for him. His Specter core simply couldn't be targeted while he stayed in mist form, unless he ran out of Zephyx entirely or a suppressor forced the core out by other means. Seeing the core vibrating on the ground, the robe understood. It burned all its Zephyx in an instant. I can see that, Pride said, irritated at the implication she couldn't have noticed herself. How strong was the attack? Strong, the robe said. Strong enough to kill an early demon instantly if it went all out the way it did against me. I couldn't track exactly how it struck. The hits were scattered across my whole body. If it attacked the other Specter the same way, it likely found its core. Pride studied the Specter core with real interest, surprisingly powerful, and as a force Specter, it could move through difficult terrain far more easily than most, genuinely useful. You will wait here, she transmitted to Nick, who answered with simple compliance. Then to the robe, I'll send another servant, make sure it doesn't kill this one too. Affirmative. The major relay deactivated again, leaving Nick alone with the robe. A few seconds later, he'd recovered enough Zephyx to return to mist form. A few minutes of silence passed, then another human appeared in the cave. Nick moved to attack, but the robe stopped him. This is an ally, it told him. You will follow its orders, same as Pride's. Nick looked at the human. You Pride, he transmitted. The human's brows furrowed, but the robe cut in before he could respond. It was simpler to let Nick believe this was the same powerful Specter from before. Explaining what a representative was would likely only confuse him and risk him attacking this one too. As long as Nick believed this was pride, he wouldn't dare. Few Specters in the world were more intimidating than pride. "Will you attack it?" the robe asked. "No," Nick answered. "I don't want to die." "Good." The robe floated out of the cave and vanished, leaving Nick alone with the human. "Follow me," the human said. Nick nodded mentally and floated after the human.